I'm a bartender by trade, and so I've had my fair share of these weird run-ins. You get pretty good at reading people. Who's there to unwind, who's there to disappear, who's there to be seen. Showboats, that kind of people. I've had a solid run at that place. A few years in, good tips, no drama. Management trusts me to close most nights. Not a bad gig. The guy in this story came in on a Tuesday. He sat 2 stools down from the service well, ordered a whiskey neat like a true lone wolf. He was around my age, clean and put together, not flashy, not sloppy, very, very normal. And that's the word that stuck with me. He watched me work and wasn't subtle about it. First round turned into 3, and somewhere between them he starts talking. Nothing wild, but it was all personal. Asked if I liked dancing, if I ever got out of the bar after my shifts. Told me I looked like I should be somewhere safer, somewhere brighter. I laughed it off and kept moving. This is what all bartenders do. We've heard it all before. And when he asked if I wanted to grab dinner sometime, I told him politely no, and that was that. He came back the next day. Same seat, same drink. This time he didn't ease into it, picked right up where he left off. I turned him down again, still polite though. He came back again, and again. 5 nights a week easy, sometimes more. He'd show up early, sometimes right before close. Always alone, always that same horny energy. He wasn't pushy exactly, never raised his voice, never got angry when I said no, but he didn't really hear it either. Just nodded, smiled, and circled back around for the next time. Textbook hound dog. Over the next few weeks, he started dropping details. Said he had a daughter, said he was divorced. Talked about work in this vague way, almost like he didn't have a job. But he always paid his tab. There was enough to build a picture, but not much else. I started to expect him, the part that I didn't like admitting, not in a good way, just that he became part of my work shift, a fixture, like the neon sign in the window or the cracked tile behind the bar. Stuff you hardly notice until it isn't there. I kept saying no anyway, despite liking the attention. Then, one night he came in really worn out. Bad shift the night before, slept like garbage, everything felt like 3 degrees off in my head. He walked in halfway through the rush and took a seat. Gave me that same look like he'd been waiting all day to see me. He starts in again, dancing, dinner, something fun. He was turning it up to 11. I was weak enough internally that this was starting to work on me. Maybe I was tired of being bored. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that he was harmless. When he asked again, I didn't shut it down. I just said, yeah, lunch. Let's do it after my work week is over. 3 days later, we met up. I picked the place. Busy, public, a little noisy, safe. He showed up on time, clean shirt, easy smile, that same confidence that it carried into my bar. Nothing felt off. We ordered sandwiches, iced tea, and sat across from one another like civilized people. And it was fine. The restaurant was one that I knew of but hadn't actually been to. I was disappointed in the menu, but more than that, the food and service itself was very meh. I know that isn't important in my story, but in my head, it felt like it took away from what could have been a nicer date. This kept me on the hook longer than I intended to be. There's no obvious red flags. He asked me about my day, told me the same stories that he'd been telling me for weeks now, about his divorce, his daughter, how hard it was to date now. A little self-centered and a little rehearsed, but not alarming. Just a guy who seemed to like to hear himself talk. I tried to meet him halfway. It was a good conversation, all things considered. When we finished eating, I expected we'd split. Instead, he said, "There's an ice cream place 1 street over. You want to talk more?" That sounded harmless. It was warm out. People were everywhere, so I said sure. We walked and talked. He pointed out shops, so he knew the area well. The ice cream place was small. I'd never heard of it. We sat outside with our cones and really relaxed. Things actually felt good. Then he says, "Well, there's a park right down the road. You ever been to it?" I had. It was a big open space with trails all over. "We could go for a walk for a bit if you want." I hesitated and he noticed. "It's broad daylight," he said, smiling. That line did it. Made me feel silly for second guessing, so I got in his truck. The park was only a few minutes away. He parked near the trailhead, further from the playground. A few cars around, but not many. people scattered across the grass. We got out and he locked the truck. That little chirp, for some reason, just echoed in my mind. We started down the path, and for a minute, it was the same conversation, and I almost regretted going out there, but the trail curved, the trees closed in, and the park behind us quickly faded. Fewer voices, less movement. Just the two of us. And I got a bad feeling in my stomach. I glanced back toward the parking lot. Not a soul in sight. "What?" he said. "I'm just making sure I know where we are." He laughed and kept walking. We took another turn deeper into the trees, and he changed. No build-up, no warning. "You're a dumb bitch for coming out here dressed like that," he said. I stopped. "What?" "You heard me." I laughed uncomfortably. "Okay, that's not funny. It's not supposed to be. You're being rude." He scoffed. Everything in me went cold, and he stepped closer, right in my face. "You got in my truck," he said. "Walked into the woods with me, dressed like that." I looked down without thinking. A skirt, a fitted top, pretty casual. He kept going. "No one knows where you are. You don't know who I am. How many hours would it take for somebody to figure out that you're missing? I know your name. I know who you are." He smiled. "No, you don't." That's when it clicked. This wasn't random. He'd been building to this. "I've always paid in cash. I've never given you my real name." I turned and started walking back the way we came, and he stayed beside me without any effort. "Where are you going?" he said. "That's nowhere to go." I didn't answer. My chest was about to explode. My hands were shaking. I kept expecting him to grab me or something. "You think you're safe behind that bar?" he said. "You're just some girl who got in my truck." Every step I took felt like it was going to be my last. No part of this park was familiar to me. I could do anything I wanted out here. You're my property. My legs felt weak. I didn't know what would make him stop talking. Then I said the only thing that I could think of. "I hope nobody ever does this to your daughter." He stopped. I took 2 more steps before I realized he was no longer next to me. I turned, expecting him to snap, but he just stood there, face blank. He let out this weird huff, and it sounded like a laugh or a grunt maybe. "Keep walking," he said. I didn't argue. We made it back to the truck without another word. My hands were shaking so bad that I fumbled my door. He watched but didn't help. The drive back was quiet. He stopped at lights, signaled, kept his eye on the road. No evidence of the threats of murder that he just made to me. When he pulled up near my car, he unlocked the doors and said, "You need to be more careful. I actually did you a favor today." I couldn't even look at him. "Yeah, thanks," I said. I actually thanked the smug bastard, I know. I got out, walked to my car, and locked the doors, and lost it as soon as I was inside. Couldn't even get the key into the ignition at first. I called my sister, then my friend, then my mom, told them about what happened, or as much as I could get out. I never reported it. I don't know his real name. I don't know where he lived, and I'd gone willingly, got in his truck, walked into that park. That was the whole point, I think, too. He made sure that I blamed myself, and in a weird way, he did open my eyes up to how vulnerable that I was in the moment, and how I'll never put myself in that situation again. This all happened in 2022, and he never came back to the bar. Years ago, I worked at a dollar store for about 3 months. It was one of those jobs that sounds simple until you're in it 8 hours a day, dealing with people that are teetering on insane and others just straight up criminals. I got screamed at by Karens over coupons, hit on by sketchy guys, and cleaned up messes composed of things that you can't even imagine. But I'd just been laid off, the money was tight, and I needed something to get by, so I stuck with it. I think the only upside was the location itself. Only 3 blocks from my apartment, straight shot down a dim street past a laundromat and a liquor store. My coworkers were decent. Our manager Lisa was in her 30s, always tired, always trying to hold the place together. We closed at 11 p.m. and by 10:15 it would usually go quiet. That night felt really normal. It was a dead store, light buzzing, me at the register just waiting it out. Lisa was in the back finishing her paperwork. The last customer had already left. Then the door slams open. A guy rushes in out of breath and eyes wide. Not drunk or high, he just looked terrified. "You need to lock the doors," he said. "Right now. Call the police." Lisa came out from the back, bracing for another issue. "Sir, what?" "I just passed your alley," he cut in. "There's two guys masked. They're not hanging out. They're about to knock this place down, and one of them has a gun." Oh, shit. Lisa didn't hesitate. She locks the door, flips the sign to closed even though we still had time left. I grabbed the phone, called the police, tried to keep my voice steady while my eyes stayed glued to the windows out front. The police showed up relatively quickly, lights washing over the store as they checked the alley, the side of the building, every place they could find. Nothing though. These men were gone, apparently. The officers then came in and told us they'd stay parked outside until we closed for real this time, just in case. That was a relief, but we were still scared. I'm 5'6", about 150 pounds, and I don't scare easily. I've lived in places where you learn to keep moving and mind your business. I've walked home plenty of times without thinking twice, but that night was different. Armed thugs just a walk away. And not just because of that, but because those guys vanished so fast, they could be anywhere. So I called my boyfriend. He came right away without any questions, and when we finally closed, he was waiting across the street with our dog, a big mutt that looked very intimidating. He walked me home quiet, alert the whole way. We hung out a bit, I told him all the drama, and he said there were all kinds of robberies going on. He went home a little while later, which was a short walk through the neighborhood, and texted me when he got back home. Zero issues. The next morning I ran into my neighbors downstairs. She looked a little off. "You hear what happened?" she asked me. I shook my head. "There's a bodega around the corner from your store. Cashier got shot, killed, around 11:30. Robbery." Same time, same area. I just nodded, but it hit me in the gut. Those guys in the alley. There was no way it wasn't them. I'd been 30 seconds away from getting shot over $600. If that man hadn't come in when he did, I didn't finish that thought. When I got to work, everything felt surreal. Lisa told me she filed a report and given the police everything. She looked even more drained and sleepless, more than normal, on the verge of a coma. After that, though, it was silence for a bit. No scares, no thugs in the alley. It was peace for 48 hours. We were still closing up a little earlier, pretty much right after the last customer around 10 p.m. A couple of days later, Lisa got called into the office, and when she came back, I knew something was wrong. "They wrote me up," she said. "For what?" "Closing early. Doors stay unlocked until 11. No exceptions." I stared at her. "Even after what happened?" She nodded. "Even with the police report. They had one complaint about us not being open until our advertised hours. Corporate is pissed." I thought she was going to quit on the spot, but she didn't. She rubbed her face and went back to work. "I've got bills," she said when I pushed. "I can't just walk." And that was that. The next night fell off from the start. Same routine, same slow crawl to closing, but there was tension under everything else. 10:45, still no customers. Lisa stood by the register with the keys in her hand, glancing at the door. You could tell she was thinking about locking it again, but she didn't. "We'll close on time." I didn't argue. I should have, but I didn't. 11. She flipped the sign to close, and for some reason still left the door unlocked. We started counting the register, going through the usual motions, and then the door opened, followed by footsteps, 2 of them. I looked up and felt my stomach drop. Masks. One of them had a gun, and he raised it right up to our faces. "Register," he said. She opened it, hands flying, pulling out bills and setting them on the counter. I could move, couldn't think, just watched Lisa handle the business. One of them glanced at me and quickly lost interest. I must not have looked like a problem. "That's it? There has to be more. These registers have been fucking shit," he screamed. "That's all the cash we have," Lisa said back. "Bullshit. You have to have a safe in the back or something." Lisa shook her head. Then the gun went off. The sound filled the store and Lisa dropped immediately. All the money in her hands went flying. They were gone just as fast. Door opened, then closed with a few $100s in a sack. Lisa lay there, gasping on the ground. I stood there not understanding what I was seeing. I moved around the corner, dropping to my knees, hands shaking as I tried to help her. There was so much blood. I remember screaming, fumbling for my phone, barely even able to talk to the operator. The cops came back and medical was on scene right behind them. We did everything we could, but it was over before it even began. Lisa didn't make it, and those guys, to my knowledge, were never apprehended. I was devastated after this incident and struggled to go back to work for a couple of months, and ended up quitting. I couldn't go back to that store. Back in 2000, I started working nights at a call center set up to what used to be an army base. It sat well outside the city, far enough that you couldn't just walk off the property and find anything resembling normal life. I'm talking about countryside. The place had been decommissioned years before, and most of it was left as is. Low concrete buildings, empty barracks, rusted fences, long stretches of cracked pavement. Eventually, they planned to turn it into a logistics hub, but at the time it was just us, one building lit up in the middle of a dead zone. If you didn't have a car, the company would run a shuttle bus. It came in before each shift and left after like clockwork. Nights were the absolute worst. The last shift would end at 11 p.m., and if you missed that bus, you were stuck out there until morning. Many people relied on this bus to get back to the city after that last shift. Now, the ride in wasn't really that bad. There was still light out, people were talking and joking. It was the ride out that was different. Everybody was tired, quiet, just ready to get home. The road off the base ran straight for a while, then curved past a stretch where the old building still stood. On one side, empty structures, dark windows, doors hanging wide open. On the other, a wide clearing, then a dense wall forest. A lot of people that worked there told stories about that stretch of land, shapes off in the trees, but most of us would ignore it, and I personally didn't believe any of it until one night. It was late summer, still kind of hot. The bus AC wasn't working and the windows were cracked enough to let in some damp jungle air. There were maybe 10 of us on board, the same old faces, a couple of guys from tech, 2 women from billing, and a supervisor who I didn't know very well. The driver was an older guy who'd been running that route forever, literally the only night driver that I'd ever seen. We pulled out at 11, right on the dot. And the first part of that ride was normal, routine. Silence, the growl of the engine. A few people had already had their eyes closed. I was sitting on the left side, halfway down the tube, watching the buildings pass on my left side. When we hit that empty stretch, the bus slowed down a little like usual. I looked across the aisle, out on the right side toward the clearing, before the trees came up. At first, I thought maybe I was just tired or a shadow from a tree, until it separated itself from the others and started dashing through the dark. It broke out from the forest with this long leap, then running into a full sprint. It was low, but not on all fours. It crossed the clearing in seconds, straight toward the road. There were no animals that I knew of out here with 2 legs that could do that. Somebody near the front made this sound, and I think they were looking out the window too. The driver didn't react though, just kept the bus steady. The thing hit the edge of the road and then matched our speed almost instantly, and most of us started to look now. Then the headlights caught it. I still can't tell you exactly what I saw. It moved insanely fast. The light was catching it in pieces, but it was tall. Its arms were hanging to the ground, almost dragging in the dirt. Its head was angled forward, trying to keep its balance. It turned toward the bus, then it was right there, on top of us, running alongside just outside the window. The first hit rattled the glass, a full body slam. Then again, and again. Heavy blows against the metal between the windows, each one shaking the frame. If it hit the glass, it would have shattered on impact. Everybody was watching now. Somebody in the back started yelling, and one of the women ducked down. Everybody else was pressed up against the left side of the bus, staring out the opposite window. I couldn't look away. It kept pace with us without effort. Every few seconds, it would lunge sideways, hit the bus again, and that impact had zero effect on the creature itself. The driver finally pressed down on the gas and the engine whined, and the bus picked up speed. We were screaming for him to go, go, go. and he kept asking us what was happening, but there was no way to explain it to him. We said that something was attacking the bus and he needed to just go. Either way, the thing stayed with us. For a moment, it actually pulled ahead into the front of the headlights. I got a little bit of a clearer look then. Its face, or whatever passed for one, was flat, pale, but not like skin, more like membrane. No real features, just dark spaces where eyes should have been and a slit where a mouth might have been. It wasn't even looking at the road. It was looking at us. It then dropped back and slammed into the side of the front wheel, hard enough to shutter the whole bus. The driver had seen it clearly and went sheet white in his seat. But still, he had the forethought to hit the gas. We were going way too fast for that road, bouncing over the dips and potholes. The thing kept pace with us for a few more seconds, then it veered off, just turned and sprinted back into the clearing, disappearing into the dark, the same way it came. The banging then stopped, and all was left was the engine and a bus full of people on the verge of tears. What the hell was that? What have we just seen out here? Everybody tried to make sense of it, but nobody had a good theory. The driver didn't look back, but had no interest in investigating anything further. He just kept going until the buildings were gone and the road opened up toward the city. When we finally hit streetlights, all of us breathed a sigh of relief. I got off my stop and went straight home. I didn't sleep because how could I? The next night, the bus still ran at 11, and for the first time ever, there was a different driver now. No one missed it, but no one sat on the right side either. Nobody sat near a window at all. Our managers told us there would be a security patrol now, somebody to keep the road monitored while people commuted. It was better than nothing, I guess. I never saw that thing again, but apparently others have. And they all seem to have a very similar story as mine. I broke down near Poplick Creek just before sundown, which is about the worst place in Kentucky to have a car decide to take a shit on you. Tasha and I were taking these back roads outside Louisville when the temperature gauge climbed up, the engine started knocking, and steam pushed out from underneath the hood. I eased onto the shoulder and killed it. I could smell all kinds of burning fluids. Tasha leaned forward, looked at the empty road, and said, "Well, that sucks." I popped the hood. Heat came off of it in a wave, damn near boiled the water in my eyes. Coolant had sprayed across the engine bay, and something lower down was dripping steadily onto the dirt. Oil, maybe. Either way, not something I'm going to be able to fix quickly. "You want to mess with it?" she asked me. "I can try, and if not, I guess we're just going to have to call a tow." She got back in the passenger seat and left the door open and propped her feet up on the frame. A minute later, I smelled weed. "Really?" I said. "We're stuck out here, I might as well be high." I didn't argue with her. I went to the truck, grabbed some tools that I had handy, and started working. At first, it was just frustrating. I checked hoses, tightened on some clamps, wiped fluid up constantly, tried to narrow it down to one problem instead of 5 of them. The woods behind us were close to the road, thick and quiet. Branches snapped now and then, leaves shifted, but nothing I looked at twice. Because when I looked up each time, I of course saw nothing. Tasha held the joint out once and I took a quick hit before going back under the hood. Didn't really help with my focus, but it did take the edge off, and suddenly I was a lot more patient. The light continued to fade, everything turning dark underneath the hood now. The tree line turned into a solid wall of shadows. I kept at it longer than I should have, mostly I think out of pride. Eventually I stepped back, wiped my hands on a rag and said, "All right, I guess we need a tow." "Fine," she said. "I'll call when I get back." "Back from where?" I asked her. "I have to pee." "Stay close, all right?" She gave me this look and walked off the road onto a narrow path that cut toward the creek. I watched her until the brush swallowed her up and then started packing my tools back up. Socket wrench, pliers, flashlight, everything was back in order. I was closing the toolbox when she came back faster than she left. Not running, but close to it, and her face looked awfully weird. "What?" I asked her. She kept glancing over her shoulder. "I think I heard somebody." "Where?" In the woods, a woman, I think, calling for help. Okay, you're definitely high. So are you, and I'm not messing with you. Before I could say anything else, now I heard it. Faint, but clear enough to pick out the words. Help me. It came right from the direction that she'd just been in. We both stood there listening. It came again. Same tone, same distance. It wasn't a bloody murder scream, but somebody definitely needed help. Tasha turned back toward the trees. We should at least check it out. Or, hear me out, we call it in. And tell them what exactly? That we think we heard something? The voice came again. Help me. I grabbed the flashlight. All right, just stay behind me. We stepped onto the path. It sloped down toward the creek, dirt packed in places and loose as hell in others, roots cutting across it like a staircase. Sweat beads started running down the back of my neck. Hello? Tasha called out. Don't do that, I said back quickly. If somebody was out there, they'd answer. The voice kept going anyway, same words, same cadence. We moved slowly, and the beam from the flashlight picked up bark, leaves, a flash of water through the trees, but nothing that matched a person. The sound of the creek started to fill my ears, and everything got hazy. Help me. Closer this time, definitely. Then I called out once, but got no response, just that same voice again. All right, this is getting weird. That's when I thought about the stories tied to that stretch of land. Everybody around Lowville had heard some version of it growing up. Something living out around the trestle, something that could mimic voices. Most of it had to be bullshit though, just tied to all the accidents and the suicides. We continued pushing a line through brush and came out near a creek. The railroad trestle rose up ahead of us, dark and narrow against that little light that was left. It crossed high over the water, old wood and steel, archaic before us. I stopped. Okay, we're done. Let's go back, I said. What? She's right here. Look. Something was crouched on the tracks, low between the rails, arms hanging down, head angled toward the trees below. At first, it didn't register as anything but a shape, but then it shifted. Help me. The sound came from above us. Tasha made this small sound and grabbed my arm. The figure straightened up. It was tall, thin, shoulders narrow, arms long enough to hang past its knees. Its head lifted up to look at us. Two horns curved up from it, not branching like antlers, but smooth, spiraled, rising back over the skull, that of a goat. It leaned forward. Help me. Same voice, same tone. Holy fuck. I pulled Tasha back without thinking about it. We turned and pushed through the brush as quick as my feet would carry me. Branches caught our clothes and snagged every 10 feet or so. She stumbled once and I yanked her back upright, and the voice kept coming behind us. Help me. We hit the road and got back into the car. I locked the doors before I'd even shut mine all the way, and Tasha slid down in her seat, now shaking. It took me a minute, but I called a tow. I had to get the location right. The woman on the line told me it would be about an hour and to stay with our vehicle. We stayed. Pretty soon, the woods went fully dark, blackout. The only light was from my phone and the weak beam of the flashlight when I pointed it out the windows. I could use the headlights, but only when I had to. The voice kept going. Sometimes it sounded like it was back near the creek, sometimes closer to the road. Help me. Over and over, like a recording. Tasha at one point covered her ears and just curled up against the door. I continued watching the tree line, expecting to see something step out at any moment. We didn't have a knife, a gun, nothing but that tool bag. At one point I swore I saw something moving along the passenger side of the car. Not a hit or a direct hit, just contact, like a hand dragging across it. Tasha flinched and ducked lower. Don't look, she said, and I didn't. We sat like that, listening, waiting. Every minute felt like forever. The tow truck finally shows up, yellow lights cutting through the trees. Driver gets out, took one long look at us, then glanced back toward the woods. You two been down by the tracks? He asked us. I didn't answer him. He just nodded. Get in the truck, I'll hook you up. We climbed into the cabin. As soon as he stepped out, that voice carried up from the creek again. Help me. He stopped just for a second, then shut his door and locked it. Nope, is all he said under his breath. He didn't waste any time after that. Hooked the car and pulled us out of there without another word. The voice didn't follow us once we were on the road, but none of us said anything until that trestle was well behind us. That creek is the waterway to hell, the driver said. It's creeped me out my whole damn life. We told him what happened to us. Well, good thing I showed up, because now you both know about the Goat Man. When we moved to Lexington, we thought we'd made it. I was 11 and the house alone felt like our ticket into the big leagues. 2 floors, a clean driveway, a yard my dad treated like a gold medal. The street had brick homes, big trees, and people who walked their dogs in the evenings. It felt stable, safe, secure. All those buzzwords a family wants to hear. We moved in there in the early 2000s after my dad got this job, a better one. My mom liked the schools, and Carrie and I were told it was a fresh start. And for a while, it's exactly what it was. We walked to the bus stop every morning, about 6 houses down past some hedges and a mailbox. Same kids, same routine. No warnings, no stories, nothing that suggested we should be paying attention beyond our own 2 feet. We settled in fairly quickly and school was normal. Weekends followed a pattern. My dad handled the yard, watched basketball, and my mom kept everything else running. Carrie, of course, made friends faster than I did, and I stayed home more than I liked to. Played games, rode my bike, didn't really think too much about it. It felt like a place where nothing bad happened, or at least nothing that could reach us. Our story would change about 6 months in. It was a Saturday morning, and Carrie and I were in the living room playing video games, wrapped up in blankets, while my dad was easing in his recliner with a big cup of coffee and the paper. My mom came downstairs already dressed, keys in hand, and asked if we wanted Burger King. That was enough to get our full attention. We didn't get it very often, so when we did, it felt like a full-on event. My dad told her to grab him 2 sandwiches. She told him he didn't need to. He said he did. Same exchange every time. She laughed, told us to pause the game, and walked out the front door. Back then, the breakfast from Burger King was legendary. Not only did it have the usual breakfast sandwiches, but they had croissants, biscuits and gravy, even those cinnamon rolls. Nummy. For about 30 seconds, nothing changed. Then we heard voices from the driveway. At first, it was normal, like somebody had stopped to talk. My dad lowered the paper but didn't move. The tone shifted. It was a man's voice, loud, cutting through whatever she was saying. And a second later, my mom started screaming. My dad was out of the chair immediately. He told us to stay inside as he moved toward the door, but we followed him anyway. By the time we stepped onto the porch, everything was already in motion. My mom was at the driver's side of the car, half in, half out, caught in an open door. Her purse was on the ground, one leg still in the car, the other flailing. A skinny man in a white tank top was on top of her, bent over, crowding her into the seat. For a second, my brain tried to turn it into something else, an argument, a misunderstanding. But then I saw the knife in his right hand, low and close to her body, and that was that. My dad ran at him and told us to call 911. Carrie grabbed my arm, pulling, and then the man looked back at my dad and drove the knife into my mom's abdomen before pulling it out again. It was quick, direct, no buildup. She made this short, sharp sound and dropped sideways over the center console. Everything was a blur after that. My sister and I were just screaming. We couldn't believe it. My dad hit the man, knocking him off her and into the side of the car. The door slammed and the horn blipped. The man swung the knife and missed, and my dad shouted at us to get inside. And this time, we listened. We ran to the kitchen and Carrie grabbed the cordless phone and dropped it. I picked it up and dialed wrong the first time, 119. No, my hands didn't even feel like mine. I tried again and got through. My mom was stabbed, I said when the dispatcher answered. I stood there with the phone in my ear, looking out to the front window while everything continued. My dad and the man were now on the ground. My dad had both hands on his wrist, trying to keep the knife away, while the man twisted and kicked, trying to break free. My mom was on her side in the car, one hand pressed to her stomach. Her hands were bloody and so was the concrete under the car. The dispatcher asked for my address and asked if the attacker was still there, asked if my mom was awake. I answered as best as I could while watching it all. Carrie stood next to me crying in these short bursts, not saying anything. Outside, my dad managed to slam the man onto the hood of the car. The knife dropped and he kicked it away before tackling him again. For a moment, it looked like he had control, but the man just kept fighting, scratching, grabbing, trying to bite him. My dad's shirt tore at the collar as he held on. Neighbors would start coming outside eventually, but kept their distance. Nobody moved in. And that part was really hard to accept, that nobody would come help my family. My mom tried to sit up and I opened up the front door and yelled at her to stay down. She looked at me not fully focused, like she didn't understand what was happening or how fast it got there. She opened up the car anyway and slid onto the ground, right next to her purse. Sirens came in from the main road not long after. 2 police cars pulled up, then another. Officers got out shouting commands, and my dad rolled away from the man with his hands up, yelling that he'd stabbed his wife. The man got to his feet, looked at the officers, then at the knife on the ground. They told him to get down. He didn't. They tased him. He dropped. And even then he kept fighting as they pinned him and finally got him cuffed. The ambulance would follow close behind. Paramedics moved in without hesitation, cutting my mom's shirt, pressing bandages onto her stomach. My dad tried to get over to her, but they held him back until the scene was finally controlled. I stayed in the doorway with the phone still in my hand until they took her away. My dad got into the ambulance with her, but before the door closed, he told a neighbor to stay with us. Then they were gone. The driveway was left quiet except for the police. We never got breakfast. At the hospital, we were told that she almost died. The knife had gone deep and there was internal bleeding. She needed surgery right away. The words were simple, but the way they were said made it clear how close it had actually been. She survived, but it wasn't easy or quick. When she came home, she moved slowly, kept a hand near her side, avoided going outside alone. My dad would check the locks multiple times at night, and Carrie slept with her light on. I started watching everything in our neighborhood, people's cars, anything that didn't fit in. That man didn't know us. That's what we were told later. There was no connection, no reason he chose our house. He was just moving through the area until he just happened to stop there. After that, the neighborhood felt like a battleground. There were break-ins, vandalism, more police driving through than I ever remembered before. People kept to themselves more. Doors stayed locked. Lights stayed on. Nothing else that happened close to that morning, though. I think we stayed in Lexington for a few years after. Life kept moving because life always does. My mom would fully recover eventually, and my dad replaced that car because she wouldn't sit in that one again. It had a lot of bloodstains that never came out. Carrie and I still walk to the bus stop, but we paid a lot more attention now to every house, to every parked car, every person we didn't recognize. I used to think you could tell where something bad might happen. Now, I know it can happen anywhere. Quiet streets, clean driveway, Saturday morning, even while your mom is just trying to go out and get you breakfast. Driving through the backwoods of eastern Kentucky in the dead of night is without a doubt the most terrifying thing I've ever done. Anybody who's ever been in the area knows exactly what I'm talking about too. All the lights from the moon and the stars are blocked by thick vegetation and the hills, so it's pitch black out there. There's history in those hills too, a lot of history, and that energy fills the place with this crazy bad vibe. It's like the very land is pissed at you, like it wants you dead. A lot of the roads aren't well traveled either. You'll be hard pressed to see a single car driving down them at night. The cell service out there, at least for me, is spotty at best, non-existent at worst, and you pray to whatever you believe in that your car doesn't break down, knowing full well the folks who live smattered across the hills are isolated, very private people. Knowing that, they might not be very happy to see you wandering around their property in the dead of night. None too happy at all. It's what my mom calls bad country, one word. She always told me to avoid the area if I could, saying that I'd likely be murdered or worse out there. I've heard plenty of stories too. Stories about people getting out of their car to help a stranded motorist, only to be ambushed, robbed, kidnapped, or murdered. Stories about strange lights and ghost killers and vanishing hitchhikers and crazy inbred hillbilly families. There are said to be hundreds of unreported deaths out there, people just vanishing off the face of the earth, never to be seen again. I've always avoided driving through those hills, but one night, I found myself on Kentucky Road 52, southbound instead of on I-75 south. Straight into those hills, straight into the darkness. I think around midnight I get a message from my mom, telling me my dad had been taken to the hospital. His condition was serious. I immediately jump out of bed and into my car, despite my mom telling me to wait until morning to drive down. I lived up in Richmond at the time while my parents were down in Hazard. It's a little under a 2-hour drive via I-75, and it's a little over 2 hours via Kentucky Road 52. That night though, of course, I-75 was closed due to an overnight bridge reconstruction progress, so I had to take 52 southbound, and it goes through some pretty gnarly bad country. I figured nothing would happen, that it'd be a smooth yet anxiety-ridden 2-hour-ish trip, but there was this dread that I couldn't shake boiling up in my gut, urging me to wait till morning, but I didn't. I couldn't. It's my dad. I gotta see my dad. I got to Richmond to Irvine just fine, driving through winding roads and hilly terrain with ease, going way faster than the speed limit. It was from Irvine to Jackson that things took a turn for the worst. First off, it was dark, like really fucking dark, even with my brights on, and they still only barely lit up the surrounding area. The constantly curving roads didn't help much either. I found myself slowing down and having to navigate through the dark, around the switchbacks and turns, inclines and depressions, hoping to God I didn't run off the road or hit an oncoming vehicle. And the dread was at the forefront of everything now. Sure, it could have been exacerbated by the worry for my dad, but there's just something about these hills, something evil, and I was really fucking afraid. The radio continued to dip in and out, so I put a CD in, Dio, and tried to drown out the fear with music, but after the first song, I turned off the stereo completely and drove in silence. All my senses were on high alert. It felt evil around me. It felt like I was being watched. Every so often, I would see a lash flight in the woods, like a campfire but brighter. And I swear at one point between Crystal and Beattyville, there was this pale and hairless humanoid running after my car next to the road. I swear, I saw it in the rearview mirror. It disappeared into the darkness in the trees when I braked and spun around in my seat. 30 minutes out of Beattyville, I saw a kid. He's wearing a yellow shirt, blue shorts, and a red jacket, hood up. Colors that reminded me of Superman. He wasn't wearing shoes, and that part bothered me. I flicked my brights down to their normal strength and slowed down to a crawl, wondering what the hell this kid, who looked to be under 10, was doing out in the middle of bumfuck nowhere. I made sure my doors were locked, cracked my window, and asked him if he was okay as I rolled toward him. He didn't respond. I glanced down at my phone. No service. Shit. I asked him if he was okay again, and he looked up at me quickly, making his hood fall down. He was crying. I slowed to a stop, and he immediately ran over, sticking dirty fingers into the crack of my window, pounding on the door. He was screaming something about how they were hunting him and that they were going to let the monster eat him and that they were watching us now, waiting just beyond the darkness. At this point, I'm fully fucking freaking out, and I might have been screaming too, who knows. I tried to roll my window up while trying not to hurt the kid at the same time, but he wouldn't release his grip on my window. I thought he was gonna break it, or at least trying to. Then out of nowhere, this bright light flashed onto us. The kid screamed even louder, let go of my car, began running down the road, back toward Beattyville. And I'm ashamed to say I took off. I was afraid I was gonna die and become another statistic out in those hills. In my rear view, I watched as what looked to be 3 men in hooded robes ran out onto the road. The spotlight one of them was holding was trained onto my car. It hit the mirror at an angle that blinded me, but it looked like the other two were going after the kid. I blinked and looked back toward the road, speeding out like a bat out of hell. I pulled off in Jackson and drove straight to the police station. 2 detectives and an FBI agent, who happened to be in town working with a liaison, listened to me with great faces. When I finished what I was saying, the FBI agent thanked me, told me that the kid had gone missing the day before from a Bible camp near Kentucky River. He said that's why he was in town in the first place. Apparently, the kid and his friends were out playing hide and seek in the woods in broad daylight when he just disappeared. He was wearing yellow, blue, and red, like Superman. The strange thing is, his footsteps just stopped and his shoes were still there. It's like he was lifted off the ground by air. Super weird. Half a dozen cop cars with twice as many cops, the agent, and a search and rescue team were dispatched to the area within minutes of me reporting what I'd seen. I drove to a local diner and ended up staying in Jackson until morning, making the 40-ish minute drive down to Hazard after the sun rose. After hearing why it took me so long to get down there, my mom was beside herself with panic, but was also glad that I was okay, telling me I did what I did to survive, that I was brave, that I wasn't in fact a coward. Thankfully, my dad ended up making a full recovery too. And if you're wondering, I do feel like a fucking coward. If you're asking if I regret not letting that kid into my car, the answer is a resounding yes. I do. I am. It still haunts me to this day, but I don't know what would have happened if I stayed there any longer, and I don't know if either of us would have made it out alive. To my knowledge, no trace of that kid was ever found.
I work at a grocery store that I won't name in Detroit, and I work almost exclusively on the third shift, so thankfully I don't have to deal with customers, and I spend most of my time stacking shelves and doing busy work. It might not sound like a glamorous job, but it's something to earn me a little money while I finish my college degree, which I'm actually set to graduate with honors. Now, it's very, very rare that anything weird happens during the third shift. Some of the workers can be a bit weird, but aren't we all who work at night? No, I'm just projecting, but I usually arrive at the store during closing time, by which all the customers have been tossed out on their butts. I don't know what happened in this particular case. Maybe she was hiding in the bathrooms or tucked away in a display or God knows what. But short version shorter, there was an elderly female customer left in the store with us when it should have been just us workers. Now maybe you'd imagine her wandering around lost or looking for her dead husband or demanding to know where we keep the pasta. Aisle 3, by the way. But no, she snuck through the whole of the store unseen, like solid freaking snake, and none of us had a clue that she was even in the store for the first hour of our shift. Now, the first sign that something was wrong was a sudden foul smell emanating from the fish department. Myself and my colleague Cherry rushed over there, curious as to what had suddenly caused a fish to just go rotten. Had a tuna exploded or something? But nothing could have prepared us for what we saw. The old woman had crawled inside the iced fish display, which was actually due to be emptied by one of us at some point, and she was rolling around inside of it, tearing fish apart with her bare hands and somehow treating them like her worst enemies. We watched in horror and, I guess, kind of amusement. We could only stare as she saw the goddamn octopus sitting there, some kind of delicacy that they didn't port it in because God knows why. Apparently people eat these things, and squid. And she was muffled by the glass, but we heard her screaming something like, "There you are," at the octopus, and began trying to tear into it. Now, octopi are stretchy and pretty hard to just tear with your hands, so this old lady had the brilliant idea to just sort of gnaw on the octopus with her teeth. Only it turns out that she wore dentures, and after a number of attempts of biting the octopus's tentacles off, she got her dentures stuck in its forehead. Thankfully, someone had called the cops by now who showed up, but it was like nobody wanted to intervene. We wanted to see what she'd do next, and unfortunately, what that involved was smashing her way out of the glass cabinet housing the fish, creating an even more disgusting smell as she charged towards us. We soon realized that there was more to it than fish. She'd soiled herself. Now, this might all seem funny to you, and frankly, it was right up until this moment. Then, covered in broken glass and bleeding profusely from shards, she lunged at Cherry, tackled her, calling her an octopus woman and accusing her of inserting eels into various orifices, and I think some troll grandson of hers had shown her some of the famous shock memes and it had just broken her brain. And the whole thing ended with the cops having to actually tase her and try to bring her down, but she was having none of it. She somehow withstood the entire taser blast. I guess it was pretty weak since they thought that she was just some old woman. And then she charged back to the fish counter, grabbed as much seafood as she could carry, and then jumped on Cherry again. Now, the next thing we know, she's trying to force an entire octopus down Cherry's throat while whipping me with some eel, and I know it sounds funny as hell, but it was honestly terrifying at the time. The fish were pierced with broken glass, and she was forcing broken glass down Cherry's throat, and she was pierced with broken glass herself, meaning that she was cutting Cherry up. And so here's the final kicker. The old woman wasn't an old woman at all. She was an old man who had made a living as a fisherman and lost his livelihood thanks to commercial fishing and grocery stores like ours switching from locally sourced produce. He had dressed as his wife because after he went bankrupt during the Great Fish Recession, she died of a heart attack, and he blamed just about everyone he could, but mostly us. Apparently our store chain had been his biggest local client, and so it ended up being a tragic and horrifying and scary incident. Cherry suffered severe damage and bleeding to her trachea, as well as some scars all over her body from the broken glass. And the store managed to keep almost all mention of it out of the papers, and the poor psychotic fisherman was taken away to spend his remaining years in psychiatric care. I still work at the grocery store on third shift, but hopefully not for much longer after I graduate. Cherry's doing just fine now, but we all insisted that we were not willing to stock imported octopi in the fish counter from there on in. Word of advice: never work in a gas station at night. This might sound kind of dramatic, but I'd rather crawl over broken glass, work down in the sewers, or be Hassan Piker's dog than work night shift at a gas station again. Maybe day shift is better, but my a-hole boss, who I really want to call a slur but don't want to get you demonetized, forced me to work night shift and night shift only. I was a 22-year-old high school dropout who'd spent 6 months in juvie and bounced from foster family to foster family, so I guess I was lucky enough to find work at all. But good God, I am very sure that it wasn't legal to force a 22-year-old to work 5 night shifts a week every week without ever changing to day shifts. And there were a lot of things about Gary's Gash and groceries that weren't strictly legal, but I'm not a rat, and Gary's been buried in the ground for nearly 20 years now. Not to mention the fact that I'm now with his daughter and she has my kid on the way, so I gotta play nice. So I'm not trying to sound like some jerk here, but Lana, Gary's daughter, is the one baiting me to write this right now. I'm actually a very nice guy in my personal life, and I'm gonna pop the question to Lana before our baby boy is born. You know, what's a better place for a proposal than a freaking Let's Read video? Lana, you make me the happiest I'd ever been, and I can't wait to raise our son with you. Now, through the power of Joel of the Golden Voice, I'm asking, will you marry me? Now, let's quickly move on to the story in case she says no. If she says yes, though, well, this will be the first serious proposal you performed on the channel, and I hope so. Now anyways, the point is, Gary was a greasy, greedy dude, and let's just say that I'm glad Lana inherited certain things from her Catholic mother rather than certain things from her father. But enough about that. We had some absolutely effing weirdos who dropped in during the night shift. There was this one guy who would spend a sickening amount of money on scratch cards, and I don't think he ever won a single cent. And from the way he dressed, he was clearly trailer trash too, and a few times I remember saying, "Buddy, do you think you should cool it with the gambling? I'm genuinely concerned about you." And you know how he responded? He hissed at me. Not even a word, he just hissed. After 3 times that, I just gave up. So there was that scratch-off jack-off, and then there was the 7-foot-tall man who came in at precisely 2 a.m. every day and bought a single Red Bull, a pack of Marlboro Lights, and one of those massive pickles in the plastic packets. Just those 3 items every single time. And the guy looked like he was about 90 as well, and sure, he was a skinny mofo, but there was absolutely no way that I was questioning him on his purchases, especially not after the hissing gambler. Now finally we had this kid, and he looked about maybe 8 tops, who would come in at around 5 in the morning every single Tuesday and Thursday, and would ask if we had any X-Men trading cards for sale. And I explained to him every single time that we didn't sell trading cards of any kind, but that didn't put him off. He'd be there every Tuesday and Thursday like clockwork, and when I told him no, he looked so upset and despondent, really. And so one day I went to the local comic shop and just got like 6 little packs of X-Men trading cards. And when the kid came in next, I presented him with the packs because surely one of them was the right brand that he was looking for. And the kid looked at the pack of cards, called me a retard, and then threw the packs back at me and stormed out. Now, to this day, I have no idea what I did wrong. The guy in the comic store told me that these were all X-Men trading cards that existed, but I guess I really don't know what I guess, but I never saw the kid again anyway, and that was kind of a relief. And I'm pretty sure that in the future, someone met this kid, and he was the inspiration for that Duck song about the lemonade and the grapes, and if you know, you know, Google it. Now, speaking of kids and short people, it's time to start the creepiest of these stories. I'm standing at the counter, minding my own business, when I just hear this rich, deep voice demand that I cook him a hot dog because all the ones on the machine are overcooked and look like crap. I glance over and, yeah, fair enough. The hot dogs had been on rotation for about 3 days if I knew Gary, so a fresh batch wasn't out of the question. The problem was, I had no idea where the request had come from. The voice demanded that I get a move on and said that he didn't have all day. And so I leaned over the counter, trying to get a better view of the store, and that's when I saw a little person standing as close to the counter as he could get without face planting. Now, I'll admit I was a little thrown that he decided to position himself somewhere that would clearly not be visible to me, but whatever. Now, I apologized profusely and said that I had no idea that he was a little person. And the guy just sort of harumphed and huffed and said that calling him a little person was deeply offensive. And so in my infinite wisdom, I apologized again and said, "I'm sorry, I meant midget." And I saw his face go red with fury, and I knew that I messed up. Now, I scoured my mind. What else did small folk like to be called? Now, this was back in the 80s, so the differences weren't as well known then. And the man explained that he had dwarfism, and so obviously I should refer to him as a dwarf. Now, fair enough. I have no problem with that, and I will refer to people however they want. I guess the thing that riled me up is that during my first time in juvie, I took an extremely nasty acid attack to the face, and it left me permanently disfigured and blind in one eye, so I clearly wasn't so intentionally ableist against people with different body types, but that's neither here nor there. I told the dwarf that I would happily make him a new hot dog if he'd head over to the machine with me so I could cook the wiener to his perfect perfection. And somehow, of course, this managed to offend the fella tremendously again, and he began screaming at me in what sounded like a Shakespearean monologue about how he shouldn't have to move, and it was my job to go and cook him a hot dog with all the trimmings and blah, blah, blah. No, actually, it wasn't. It was a self-service hot dog machine, but I wasn't going to argue. I told him that I'd head over and cook him up the best hot dog he'd ever had. Now, the dwarf replied by saying that it was too late now. I'd screwed everything up, and it was time to face the consequences. In complete shock, I watched as the little man rose to his full height of around 6 foot. At the same time, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a sawed-off shotgun. He told me that if I went for the panic alarm or anything like that, he'd blast a hole in my chest the size of a foot-long hot dog. And you know what? Screw it. Screw Gary. I wasn't getting killed over a job that barely paid enough for me to live and forced me to work 5 nights a week at Gary's. And I told the now 6-foot dwarf to chill and emptied the register for him. He filled a bag that he'd produced from nowhere and gave me a very cruel smile and just strutted out of the gas station. Or he almost did. For some reason, he paused to unload a shotgun round into the hot dog station and blasting that thing into pieces, leaving my ears ringing, and then he left. Now, my heart was pounding harder than it had when I'd done 4 lines of, well, never mind. Immediately, I pressed the panic button and I called 911 for good measure. Screw Gary. Those cops could actually wake him up. And so when the cops got here, we discovered a bunch of things. 1, Gary was too cheap to actually buy an outdoor security camera, so that one was actually fake. And so we had absolutely no footage of this fake dwarf leaving the premises. However, the interior cameras did work, and I was able to see how he'd tricked me. He'd been kneeling on shoes, positioned in a perfect practice pose, so I had no chance of seeing his real legs. This explains why he didn't want to accompany me to the hot dog machine, though. And hilariously, this fake dwarf had been the suspect in a bunch of local robberies. He'd never fired his weapon before, and you know what got him caught? The fact that he took the time to shoot the crap out of that hot dog oven. Now, they were able to trace that buckshot of the gun to the owner and get his ass busted. He'd robbed enough places that I'm pretty sure that he'd actually die behind bars. What a shame. And as for me, I got my ass absolutely chewed out by Gary for handing over the cash and not risking my life by grabbing the baseball bat under the counter. I quit on the spot. I got my life together and I went back to school. I graduated, then got a degree, and some years later I met a woman that I fell head over heels for. Now imagine how shocked I was when I discovered that she was Gary's daughter, and hated him even more than I did. We originally bonded over drinks, where she shared our glee that he was dead, and now I know I sound like an ass, but you didn't know the man. He wanted me to die rather than hand over $200 or so to a fake dwarf. Screw Gary, screw the fake dwarf. I work in a very lucrative field now, and my life's freaking awesome. And that's why I'm writing to another awesome person, you, Let's Read, and I hope you enjoyed my story of a bunch of weirdos, at least one of whom nearly murdered me. And if you didn't, well, I know people who will shove a hot dog where the sun don't shine. Have a beautiful day. Hi, Joel. I grew up in Britain, although my parents are French. You'd never know it, though, because I have the most posh, London-sounding accent that a French girl could ever have. This might be because of the school that I went to, or because I left school in college, and I took some time out before university to work as an air hostess. I loved that job and ended up staying in the air for 5 years. Not literally, of course, but you get what I mean. I left sixth form college in 1997, and the story that I'm about to share with you took place in 1999. This was a couple of years before, everything changed with the planes, and security was very different back then. Things were a lot more lax, and it was much easier to get up to high hijinks. For one thing, you could still join the Mile High Club without too much trouble. Not that I ever did that, of course. I honestly would never. I shouldn't joke about that kind of thing, considering the story that I'm about to share with you, or joke about anything, really. So this story took place on the first ever red-eye flight that I was working. I'm sure everyone knows what a red-eye flight is by this point, but if by some small chance you don't, it's a flight, generally a shorter one, that takes place at night and often involves the passengers sleeping for the duration. If you take the red-eye, you're meant to stay quiet, calm, and well-behaved. I can't remember if kids were flat-out banned from our red-eye flights, but I don't ever remember any kids or babies on the handful that I worked. Now, this was 27 years ago, so bear with me. I've not worked as an air hostess for almost as long, and I haven't thought about planes in a long time. From what I can recall, the plane, run by some long bankrupt airline that you probably never heard of, was divided into 2 sections. The front section, closer to the cockpit, was for passengers who wanted to stay quiet and chill but weren't intending to sleep. It was the cheaper option and usually the busier one. Then the back of the plane, in reverse of the usual, was sort of the first class section, except this was for people who wanted or needed to sleep, so it was filled with bed seats. I was working up front, which suited me just fine because I didn't want to tiptoe around snoring old businessmen. And the sleeping area always smelled like farts too, so that was lovely. A red-eye typically doesn't have as many flight attendants as a regular flight, or at least it didn't back then. I think there were just 3 of us on that flight, although I could be misremembering. What I do remember is that I was up front, obviously, and my dear, queer, gentle friend Adam was working the sleeper section. Do you remember H from Steps? I don't know if Steps was that big in the United States, so maybe you never knew him, Joel, but if not, Google him and stick a picture up on screen if you can. Adam looked just like H from Steps, only he was a lot calmer, quieter, and more gentle than H, who always seemed like he had the energy of 50 men. Now make sure you Google H from Steps and not his real name, Ian Watkins, otherwise you might get that nunce from Lost Prophets, another singer who unfortunately shared a name. Now, he did some really, really terrible things, and you should do a true crime story about him one day, actually. That'd be actually very interesting. He was shanked in prison recently, too. Died. What a tragedy. Now, anyways, Adam was like a really calm and gentle H from Steps, and I promise this is important eventually. Partly it's important because the villain of this story, who we'll call Ian, looked kind of like the Lost Prophets guy. Although he wasn't really famous at the time, and we didn't know he was a major criminal, so maybe I'm just misremembering. I'll call him Ian anyway, because nearly every guy called Ian I've ever met was a proper prick, if you get me. except for my cousin Ian, who's an actual right laugh. So anyways, back to the red-eye. Because I was working at the front of the plane, most of the passengers ate late-night airline food, and that meant that it was my job to collect up the trays with their rubbish on them. Now, I did this on autopilot, pun intended, sticking them on my trolley with a little "thank you, sir," or "thank you, ma'am," or "thank you, lovely," if they were some old biddy who was so wrinkled that they could have been a lad or a lass, or how do I put this tactfully? Someone who was very, very large and made it impossible to tell their gender. Now anyways, you had to be really careful about that back then. Christ, I mean, I feel bad for air hostesses in the 2020s, and I bet there had to have been some actual moments where a 20-year-old sweetheart had called a bearded passenger sir and been chewed out for not recognizing that they were a pretty princess. Oh Christ, I shouldn't have had those last couple of glasses of wine before writing you this email. Now anyways, I got my trolley full of trays and crap to the center of the plane and began chucking away the plastic boxes that the dinner had come in. And that's when I noticed it. A napkin with writing scrawled across the whole thing. "I know what you did on that plane," they'd written. And then a crude picture of what was definitely supposed to be me because, well, I could just tell, okay? Now, there had only been about 7 or 8 passengers who'd had dinner, so the note couldn't have come from too many people. I don't know why I even cared because I hadn't done anything on any plane by that point, but the drawing had been very rude and insulting, and I was young, so I guess I felt kind of threatened by it. It didn't take long for me to notice Ian, even in the low, dim lights of the red-eye flight. Now, he was a guy about my age with slicked back hair and a goatee that made him look like a proper wrong'un. Now, he kept giving me the evils, looking at me like I was a bit of dog poo on the sole of his shoe, but then also sometimes like he wanted to lick it. Now, I'm going to stop this comparison there because I'm squeaking myself out, but you get the idea. I was disgusted by him, but he still wanted a piece of that, you know? And so I guess he was watching when I was looking, and he saw me looking, and then he started calling me over and asking for things like, "Hey girl, can I get a bottle of water?" Or, "Got any napkins? I seem to have lost mine." And my favorite, "Way up, whoa lass, can you handle these nuts for me? I haven't had any complimentary airline peanuts yet. So, can you get them?" And that's what he said, word for word, and I swear on the Bible about it. As an air hostess back then, at the dodgy flight company I worked for, you were taught to always smile, be as flirty as possible, and take as much crap from passengers as you could tolerate. I remember once, before this red-eye, I got chewed out for telling a passenger off after he touched my butt, and he said it was an accident and apologized, so apparently I was in the wrong for muttering "perv" under my breath as I walked off. Now anyway, after I gave Ian his nuts, he called me back again about 10 minutes later and said that they really were salty, and then he asked me if I like salty things, which I pointedly ignored. And so he just laughed and said he needed another bottle of water and asked if I could be a good girl and go fetch him one. Of course, I did just that. What I didn't realize was that Ian got right out of his seat and followed me into the middle of the plane, where we kept things like bottled water and complimentary peanuts. The bathrooms were nearby, so at first I wasn't alarmed by the sensation that someone had followed me. Unfortunately, it was Ian, and he wasn't headed to the bathroom. Instead, he grabbed me, pinned me against the wall, and shoved some kind of hand towel against my mouth to gag me. And then he leaned in close and started whispering in my ear about what a terrible person I was. He didn't say it exactly like that, obviously. He said some proper vile stuff. Stuff that now, as a grandmother in my early 50s, I'd give a lad a good lick in the dick for. But back then, though, I was just a little wee thing and I was terrified. I started crying almost immediately, and Ian was all cruel and callous, saying that I brought this on myself. And he said I'd betrayed him after what I did on the last flight, and asked how I was okay with throwing away 7 years of our relationship. And that's when I realized that this guy somehow believed that I was someone totally different, specifically his girlfriend or ex-girlfriend, who was also apparently an air hostess and had cheated on him on a flight. I didn't know it at the time, but his brain was absolutely fried from a cocktail of alcohol, MDMA, and coke, which I guess explains his temporary insanity. And things escalated when he tried to force me into the bathroom, pushing the hand towel so deep into my throat that I couldn't even try to scream. None of the passengers were turning around, and it was just me and Ian and a curtain separating us from the sleeper section. Now, the best I managed was slapping the wall, trying to do some type of SOS. I got maybe 2 short slaps in before Ian grabbed me between the legs over my skirt and squeezed in a way that made it very clear that he'd do worse if I kept going. I guess my beloved friend H heard the slapping because suddenly I saw all 5'5" of him peeking through the curtain. And then, holy God, he stormed toward Ian. And then, holy God, he yanked him off of me. My gentle, sweet buddy H didn't hesitate. He smashed his forehead into Ian's face, and the crunch of a bone sounded like a gunshot in that silent plane. And then H was yelling that a man was trying to assault his colleague. And H absolutely bodied him. It turned out he was a brown belt in Krav Maga. He floored Ian in seconds, tied him up with plastic ties, and even broke bones in his foot when Ian tried to kick out. Ian spent the next 3 hours hog-tied in an out-of-order bathroom next to a toilet full of poop. We radioed ahead, and police were waiting at Heathrow. This Ian guy was arrested immediately, and after that, things changed. I became more cautious, I went to therapy eventually, and I gained a whole new respect for H. I stayed in the job for another 3 years and then left, and life moved on. But I'll never forget the terror of that night, or the man who saved me.
In your last video, you had a story that took place in Peru, and it reminded me of my experience in the neighboring country of Ecuador. In the early 2000s, I had just gotten my degree, and I was looking to take a vacation before I started job hunting. My idea of a good time is seclusion. To this day, I'm an avid hiker who enjoys traveling to remote locations in the United States, Canada, and South America. A friend of mine suggested that Ecuador had some scenic hiking trails and that tourism there is extremely low because of the country's severe instability. I never minded a little danger, and the less tourists, the better. They always ruin the atmosphere for me. Despite how Caucasian sounding my name is, I'm actually half Mexican on my mother's side, and I speak fluent Spanish. The point being, I could blend in easily. A day after landing in Guayaquil, I was deep in the Cerro Blanco forest, miles from anywhere. The canopy was so thick, it felt like evening time, despite it being in the middle of the day. I came to this location specifically to capture a photo of what they call the cloud forest, where trees become shrouded by low-hanging clouds, which creates a sort of localized fog area. But during my hike, I came across something very out of place. A white box truck, parked right in the middle of the forest. There was no road, no clearing, just trees all around it. I thought maybe the truck had broken down and was abandoned, but the truck looked like it was in good shape. I found it odd, but I wasn't looking for trouble, so I kept moving. That's when the first arrow flew right past my head, missing me by inches. Before I could even process what was happening, another arrow struck me in the shoulder. The pain was instant and burning. I ran as more arrows were shot in my direction. I came upon an area of tall bushes and dropped to the ground behind one of them, trying to make myself as small as possible. While I was hiding there, bleeding and trying not to make a sound, I saw a camouflaged figure emerge from the trees about 30 yards away, holding a crossbow. He moved slowly, scanning the area. He was clearly hunting for me. After what felt like forever, he finally disappeared back into the foliage. I soon heard the box truck start up and drive away. I stayed hidden for another 30 minutes. I knew not to remove the arrow, but I was still losing blood, and I had to get moving. I made my way back toward the parking area as fast as I could. When I finally reached the lot, I was exhausted and collapsed. Fortunately for me, several bystanders were there to help me. The police were called, and I was rushed to a hospital. A detective later came to speak with me when I was feeling better. He told me the box truck I saw was almost certainly being used by drug traffickers. The deep canopy of the Ecuadorian forests made perfect mobile staging points for moving narcotics. The man who shot me was probably guarding that shipment. It was in a remote location, but since it was near a hiking trail, the attacker may not have wanted to make too much noise, which is likely why they used a crossbow. I eventually made a full recovery and returned home as soon as I was able to. This happened in 2002. Since then, Ecuador has made a lot of progress and is a much safer place to visit now, but I've never returned there after that. There were a few articles written about what happened to me, but I can't seem to find any of them on Google. Over 20 years have passed, and I still go hiking whenever I can, and I always bring a handgun with me, if where I'm going allows it. It was around 2005 that I had to take a long hiatus, because that's when I met my wife and started a family. It wasn't until around 2018 that I started taking sporadic trips again. There was a while where I'd find myself looking at photos of my wife and kids, and a haunting thought would creep into the back of my mind. If that arrow had just been a few inches more to the left, I never would have met my wife, and my kids would have never been born. I likely would have disappeared forever. I was on my way back home to New Jersey from New York City. I had gone to go see a Knicks game at the Madison Square Garden that night. For full context, I went to a nearby nightclub and did a bit of drinking before heading back. So by the time I left the club, I was feeling a bit inebriated. I was absolutely not going to get behind the wheel of a car at night in the middle of New York City. I made my way to Penn Station and took the train to Times Square, got off, and walked over to the Port Authority bus terminal. Once I got there, I saw that it was empty. Not a single soul in sight. Suddenly, I was pushed from behind, and as soon as I fell to the ground, I felt at least 3 people kicking me while I was down. I curled up into a ball as I was assaulted. I then felt my wallet being taken as I just laid on the ground, completely defenseless. The 3 assailants ran off, and I was left there with no money or identification. Thankfully, my phone had not been taken during the attack. I rapidly pressed the power button 5 times, which connected me to a police operator. I told the dispatch what had just taken place, and they said that they would be sending a car out right away. I was still pretty shaken up about what happened, breathing heavy, and my words were trembling as I spoke. I turned my head to the right to see a knife laying there. It must have fallen out of one of the robbers' pockets as they were kicking me. I'm just glad it wasn't used on me. The police got there in under 5 minutes, along with the EMTs. I was rushed to the hospital, where I told my story to the police. After being treated, I was released the next day. I'm still pretty upset that I lost $300 in cash, along with all my credit cards and driver's license, but my life is more valuable than any of that stuff. I'm still in communication with the investigators assigned to my case. No arrests have been made yet, and I'm not sure if they'll ever be able to track them down. If the police do end up catching them, I'll be 100% pressing charges. This story has become all too familiar within our society, especially in New York City. As a victim who was traumatized and beaten, we should never accept this as normal. People should be allowed to walk down the streets or ride the subway and not have to worry about being attacked or harassed. I hope that by sharing my experience, it'll help others be more aware if they ever plan on visiting the big cities, because this problem is nationwide. My name is Muhammad. I am a practicing Muslim living in New York City. Back in 2015, I was always bullied in middle school for my religion. There were 2 bullies in particular whose names were Frankie and Johnny. They would take things to an extreme, which included assaulting me, chasing me, shoving me into lockers, and they even ganged up on me one time to dunk my head into one of the toilets. Funny enough, I had some friends who would preach about social injustice and Islamophobia in America, but they did not step in when they saw me being bullied. It was approaching the first weekend of December. My parents wanted to go upstate to our countryside house, which was located near the Catskill Mountains. I invited my best friend Jaden to come along with us. We drove out of the city at around 6 p.m. on a Friday night and got to the house around 8:30. After unpacking, we all went to bed. The next morning, Jaden and I wanted to go geocaching, since the house was right next to a state forest, which had plenty of hiking trails. If you don't know, geocaching is an outdoor activity where you use a GPS device to find hidden containers, kind of like a treasure hunt. Jaden and I have been doing this since the first grade. My parents gave us permission, but we were only allowed to do it for 4 hours. So, we then set off into the forest. An hour and a half passed, and we had already located 4 treasures on our hike. We were now near a waterfall, and the next box was 0.4 miles away from our current location. As we were walking and trying to locate the next geocache, we heard something moving around behind us. We turned around, and what I saw was scarier than any horror film I've watched. Here in this forest, many miles away from the city, I saw the 2 people who are currently making my school life a living hell, Frankie and Johnny. How the hell were they in the same exact place we were in? Did their families secretly have a house up here? Did they follow us? I didn't know how this was even possible. They couldn't have got there by themselves, since they were the same age as Jaden and I. Once I saw them, I blurted out, "What the heck are you 2 doing here? How did you guys even find us? You thought by coming out here you were safe from us? I don't fucking think so." We then saw a large knife in Frankie's hand. I didn't have time to think about how crazy this situation was. Jaden and I were now in danger. Suddenly, Johnny sprinted toward me. Before I could even run, he shoved me to the ground and held me down. Johnny was much bigger than me, and it was impossible for me to escape. He grabbed the back of my neck and forced me to the edge of the waterfall. There were no safety bars to prevent me from falling over. Was Johnny actually planning on killing me? I was now terrified for my life. I heard Jaden yelling for help, and I remember seeing him being held down by Frankie, who still had the knife. Both of our lives were now in danger. As Johnny and I neared the edge, I tried my best to break free, but it was no use. I clearly remember him saying, "This is what you fucking get. You bastards killed my uncle." His tone was downright demented. I pleaded with him not to kill me, pointing out that my family was born in America, but he didn't listen. I started to shout, hoping somebody would hear me. Then from behind the 4 of us, we heard a gunshot. Johnny immediately let go of me. There was a man dressed in hunting gear, with a rifle in his hand. Now, before you make any assumptions, let me clear him of any wrongdoing. We were in a non-hunting section of the park, but we were also in an area that bordered a private property that did allow hunting. There is a barrier of fencing that separates the 2 properties, but there are several ways to get past it. This man must have been hunting nearby, heard us struggling, and came running. The gunshot we heard was him firing his rifle into the air.
"You 2, let them go and get the hell out of here."
Frankie and Johnny then disappeared into the forest. The hunter made sure that we were okay and offered to escort us back to the house. We accepted, since we were still worried about Frankie and Johnny surprising us again If they followed us all the way out here, it wasn't out of the realm of possibility. On the way back, he asked us who those two guys were. I told him the truth and said that they were school bullies and that they somehow managed to follow us all the way from New York City to this upstate forest. The man was floored by this, telling us that the kind of people who would go to those lengths are dangerous, and there was a very real possibility they would have killed the two of us. We made it back to my parents' property about 10 to 15 minutes later. We had a lot of explaining to do to my parents when they saw us being followed by a man with a rifle. We told them that this man saved us from two bullies who would constantly harass me at school. They didn't believe the story at first because, frankly, it sounded insane, but they spoke to the hunter who backed us up. After hearing the full story, they were in shock. After some discussion, we all agreed to go to the local police station, even if it meant the hunter would get into trouble. Under the circumstances, hopefully the authorities would understand. We met the hunter at the police station a couple hours later. We gave our statements as my parents waited in the lobby. They thanked us for coming forward and said that they would try to get in contact with our school back in the city. Hearing them say this put me in a much better mood. The hunter was let off with a warning for discharging his rifle in a restricted area. The remaining time at the country house was pretty chill. I was a bit worried that we would run into Frankie and Johnny at school the next day. But that Monday, I was called into the principal's office before classes started and was told that Frankie and Johnny had both been expelled, and criminal charges were being considered. Although since they were teenagers, the worst that would happen is a stint in juvenile hall. But I was happy to hear that both of these assholes would no longer bother me at school anymore. The rest of my school years went by pretty smoothly. Every once in a while I would still get called names, but it never came to physical bullying again. And I learned not to take it too personally. I never saw or heard from Johnny again, but I did run into Frank one last time in 2019. I was walking on a sidewalk around Times Square, and he happened to be walking in the opposite direction. I don't think he even noticed me. I wish I would have stopped and asked him how he and Johnny managed to follow us all the way to our country house upstate, because I have not got to the bottom of how exactly they were there that day. My follow-up question would have been why he and Johnny were such psychotic, racist assholes to me. I eventually moved past this incident, but the memory of what happened almost a decade ago sometimes plays back in my mind and serves as a reminder that there will always be screwed up people in this world.
This happened right after my divorce. It was a very rough time in my life. I was exhausted, stressed out, and needed to get away from everything. I rented out a small cabin deep in the forests of Vermont so I could work on my first novel in solitude. I had never been to Vermont before this. I'm from the West Coast. I chose it randomly because at the time, I was so paranoid that my ex-husband would follow me. Things did not end amicably between us, so I reasoned that Vermont would be the last place he'd ever go looking for me. The cabin was beautiful, surrounded by thick forests with no neighbors for miles. At first, it felt like exactly what I needed. But after a couple of days, I started hearing strange noises at night, scratching sounds on the roof, footsteps on the front porch, and I thought I even heard voices whispering outside at one point. Given what I was going through at the time, this set me on edge. It wasn't just at night either. When I would go outside during the day, I got this overwhelming feeling that someone was watching me. I told myself it was just my paranoia from the divorce, and I wasn't exactly used to being alone in the woods. This went on for a few more days. I never encountered anyone though, so I just figured that perhaps my mind was playing tricks on me. One night, I woke up to a loud banging on my bedroom window. There was no way to rationalize it this time. There was someone outside the cabin. I sat up, heart racing, and looked to the window, which had the curtain drawn. Another loud pounding came, causing me to jump. Who's there? Do you have any idea what time it is? No one answered. After maybe 5 minutes of hearing nothing, I peeked out the window. The woods were dark and still. There was no one in sight. The thought had occurred to me that I experienced some kind of night terror, but just to be sure, I grabbed a flashlight and made my way out to the front door. Once I saw that there was no one on the front porch, I opened it carefully, then shined the light into the yard. That's when I saw them. There were maybe 10 men total, standing silently in the front yard and among the trees. All of them were wearing black hoods that covered their faces. In fact, that was the only thing any of them were wearing. They just stood there, like nude statues staring at the cabin. I'm not sure if I screamed or yelled at them, but it wasn't long after they all began to pleasure themselves. I was disgusted beyond words, but then I suddenly became more terrified than I had ever been in my whole life. Those freaks outside could easily force their way into the cabin. I was alone and defenseless. I slammed the door and locked it, then immediately retreated to the bedroom. I pushed a wooden wardrobe in front of the window before praying to God that the landline next to the bed was still working. Thankfully, it was, but I was shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. By the time the officers arrived 15 minutes later, the men were gone. The police took my statement and told me something that made my blood run cold. They had apparently received several reports from other women in the area who had either rented cabins like me or lived in remote locations. It was the same thing. Several naked men wearing black hoods, standing in the nearby woods. The officer told me that he was only aware of one other instance where someone witnessed them masturbating. The police were never able to catch them. They took the reports seriously, but it was unpredictable where they would show up next, even with increased patrols. They theorized this was some kind of bizarre cult ritual. They would make sure the women were alone, possibly scouting locations before they moved in, although they never seemed to attack or break in. It was like they wanted to make sure the women saw them. Most of the time, things wouldn't go according to plan. The women either wouldn't answer the door or a neighbor would see them and start yelling. Either way, the men would disappear back into the forest before the police could arrive. I left the cabin the next morning and never went back, and spent my remaining time in Vermont in a hotel room in Burlington. After this incident, I've done extensive research into this topic over the years. Vermont is a very small rural state, and it does have a history of cult activity. There's also a local urban legend dubbed the Men in Suits. During the 90s, there were numerous reports emerging from isolated areas describing well-dressed men appearing in locations where they clearly did not belong. I guess you could title my experience the Men in Birthday Suits. As I mentioned at the beginning, I do plan on getting the full story published someday, but in the meantime, I'd love to hear.
I'm in the Netherlands on a work trip. And in the evening, I find myself alone in a hotel with nothing to do. Like any self-respecting gay man, reading or watching TV seems like pretty unedifying pastimes when you've got free time. So why not compulsively throw myself onto Grindr for hours and maybe risk my life meeting some weirdo? I started chatting with this cute, nice young guy. He lives fairly far from my hotel, so we decided to meet halfway to get to know each other. 5 kilometers on foot, which I happily do because I like walking around new cities. Not knowing the local geography, I imagine pubs and bars, and instead I find myself in a rather lonely, gloomy part of town. We meet and he's actually much better looking than in the photos. But if on chat he was friendly and nice, in person he seems pretty reserved and unsociable, which I chalk up to Dutch stiffness. I talk to him and he replies in monosyllables with no engagement whatsoever. The emotional and physical affective deprivation my parents raised me with has produced me, an insecure egocentric who has to be liked by the other person at any cost. If he likes me, my unconscious suggests I'll heal my narcissistic wound and finally be worthy of my mom's love. I perform my personal mating dance. He's sufficiently smitten. Out of nowhere, he invites me to his place, and I accept. We get to his place another 5 kilometers away right in the countryside, and my phone stops getting a signal. I don't know if it's a lack of coverage or if I just ran out of credit. The house is nothing like I imagined. It looks like the house of an old lady who collects doilies. He tells me the villa we're in was actually inherited from his grandmother, and he's been living there alone for several years. He shows me what he's cooking in the kitchen, a nauseating watery stew that I hope he won't offer me. He takes me into the living room. We sit on the couch and he loosens up a bit. Between one chat and another, he tells me he's a fashion designer and that he produces the fabrics he uses himself with the help of a 3D printer, a super innovative technique. I tell him I know a Dutch designer who uses the same technique. Her name is Iris van Herpen. Pause. He starts foaming at the mouth. He begins telling me that this very Van Herpen stole his ideas and he wants to sue her. He pulls out DVDs of his fashion shows and comments on every single piece, meanwhile showing me YouTube videos of the established designer's shows with the supposed copies of his work. If Van Herpen's models look like ethereal, graceful works of art walking down the runway, his models wearing his creations look like runaway girls on the third walk of shame of the week. I don't tell him this, and on the contrary, I nod along sympathetically to his megalomaniac statements. As I resign myself to the idea that nothing's going to happen, he kisses me, one of the worst kisses of my life, surely a harbinger of far worse performances. I try to guide him and improve things, but nothing. He just can't do it. Like your grandpa when you try to teach him how to use email. He stops and he tells me he'll be right back. He goes upstairs to the second floor. 10 minutes go by and he's still nowhere to be seen. I approach and shout, "Hey, everything okay?" "Yes, of course," he says. Could it be that he wants me to go upstairs and I'll find him naked, bent over? I ask him, "So, should I come up?" To which he just says, No, wait." I wait. Another 20 minutes pass. Is he taking a shower? Yet I don't hear any water running. After a while, much darker possible scenarios start to crowd in. Ones anyone with a bit of common sense would think of if they found themselves in an isolated stranger's house. Is he putting on a raincoat to protect himself from the blood once he chops me up? Is he sharpening an awl with which to carve red rum into my belly after chaining me to the fireplace? I decided to make a run for it. If the idea of being murdered by a stranger has just barely surfaced, the doubt turns into certainty when I realize that the door we came in through is locked. Oh my God, I'm going to die. I go to the kitchen where there's another door, and that one's locked too. Oh crap. I go back to the living room and meanwhile scan the place for possible escape routes. In a dramatic flash forward, I picture myself throwing an armchair through a window and then jumping out and running away, or finding a flashlight in the bookcase to send Morse code distress signals. After about 50 minutes, he comes back downstairs impassive. "I want to have sex with you," he adds without any emotion. I've completely lost the desire. I'm genuinely convinced he's going to kill me. I tell him that I have to go home and that it's late. He replies that I can't go home now. He wants to fuck. I tell him he took too long and that I have to go back to my hotel, which is 10 kilometers away, and it's pitch dark by now. He sighs. I ask him to let me connect to his Wi-Fi since my phone has no signal so I can follow the route on Google Maps. He points to a modem blinking under a chair. The password's underneath. I crouch down to look for the password on the sticker on the back of the modem. After a few seconds, I realized I'm bent over with him behind me. While trying to type the password, I keep glancing at him as he watches me slyly from the couch. My hands are shaking. At a certain point, I see him lean forward from the couch to grab something behind a piece of furniture, an object I can't see, and that I decide it must be a weapon to knock me out. I jump up, grab a lamp, brandishing it, then telling him, "Let me out of here." He looks at me surprised. "If you want to go, go." I tell him that the door's locked. He looks astonished at this statement. "Follow me," he says. I'm now certain I'm going to die. I keep the lamp with me. He looks at me impassively, as if this were practically normal. I follow him and we go into the kitchen where the nauseating stew reigns supreme, and he tells me the keys are there. The light in the room is off. He walks in without turning it on and opens a drawer, and I clearly hear the clinking of cutlery. Oh my God. He wants to attack me with a kitchen knife. I suddenly turn on the light and keep brandishing the lamp. He looks at me coldly and takes the keys from the cutlery drawer. We head toward the door, and as soon as I'm outside, I run like hell, all while the lamp is still in my hand. It takes me 2 hours to get back to the hotel. As soon as I enter my room, I open my laptop, and since his first and last name were visible in the fashion show he tortured me with, I block him on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, etc. Years later, this encounter unsettles me so much that every now and then I Google the city name, fashion designer, and killer, sure that sooner or later he'll kill someone. I'm left with 2 questions. What did he do alone on the 2nd floor for 50 minutes? Was he actually preparing the post-coital crime scene? Did he take Viagra and wait for it to kick in? What was he trying to grab from behind the piece of furniture? A weapon? A portable Wi-Fi hotspot for my dead phone? A dildo? Unfortunately, I don't think I'll ever know. Back in late 2023, I began seeing a man in my neighborhood walking his dog. I would see him in the morning when I went to work, maybe 2 to 3 times a week. He's an average-looking guy, maybe in his 60s. I would see him again regularly when I came home. Since I worked an 8 to 5, I didn't think much of it. Just assumed we had similar schedules. He always wore the same blue jacket. I didn't think much of it because it looked like a rain or wind jacket, so I thought it was just what he threw on to walk the dog. He would stare a lot when he walked by, but again, assumed maybe he was just a lonely guy and didn't think too much of it. One day I asked him if he had got the end of the year letter from the HOA, and he seemed confused. I repeated myself, and he said that he hadn't received anything yet. Wrote this off as well because I assumed that he was just caught off guard. I had been seeing him daily for months, but we never spoke. He genuinely seemed shocked by me speaking to him. I told him to keep a lookout for it, and he just stared and went back to walking his golden retriever. I began seeing him even more after this. By Christmas, I was seeing him at least once a day, if not twice. I treated him like every other neighbor, and did a quick neighbor wave whenever I saw him walking his dog. In March, I had separated from my husband. He moved out and took the dog. He owned him before I came along, so I understood this. Since I was now alone and sad, my mom stayed with me for a while. She doesn't work, so she would be at my house during the day while I was gone. She noted the same guy always walking by. She noticed that he always stared too, and it was kind of odd. She waved hello to him a few times, but he never did anything but just stare and walk his dog. She said since he walked the dog often, but also seemingly on a schedule, he could have early onset dementia, or maybe he was sick somehow and using the dog walks as a way to get exercise. We both agreed he was very odd but harmless. After a month or so, my mom went back to her house and I was living alone. One thing I loved about that house was the fact that the backyard butted up to a national park. Beyond my fence was trees and forest. After my husband and dog left, I would be sitting in the backyard and hear what sounded like footsteps. It was almost always late at night when I'd be sneaking out for a late night cigarette before bed. I was drinking a good amount at the time, so I figured 1, I was paranoid, and 2, I was probably hearing raccoons or opossums in the woods, and 3, having the dog before would have scared off any critters. It didn't happen every night, far enough apart that I was able to write it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My fence had horizontal planks rather than your more standard vertical style. There were gaps you could see through if you were right on it. I looked over the fence in the daylight for a sign of anyone back there. The National Forest kept the fire break cleared between the edge of the park and the back of the homeowner's property, so it was difficult to tell if anyone had been there or not. I'd started noticing lighters and cigarettes missing from the backyard. I would swear I had an almost full pack going to bed, but when I'd check the next day, it would be half empty. I wrote this all off due to my heavy drinking. My cousin started coming over and helping me do some handiwork around the house on the weekends. The neighbor guy in the blue coat would walk his dog every day still. He would now stop and watch my cousins from the sidewalk as they did work at the house. He would let the leash out for the dog to come up to them, but they didn't pet it because it smelled awful. I told them the theory my mom said, that he was sick and weird, but harmless. They didn't agree, and the next time he let the dog into the driveway, my cousins had told him to screw off. From what they told me, he just stared at them for a while, then walked off. From then, the man would still stare, but it was even creepier now. When I would drive by, he would stop and watch me, as in physically turning his body to follow my car as I went by. I would always wave as if it were any other neighbor, as I always did, and he didn't flinch. Around June, a friend of mine moved in. She was going through a divorce as well, and I was happy to have someone to hang out with after work. We had a lot of fun drinking and burning fires in the fire pit. And it began again. The sound of footsteps in the woods. We were both drunk, so we ran inside and just laughed it off. This happened a handful of times over the next few months. I would hear things more often when I was alone. My roommate split her time, so she was never with me on the weekend. She had noted the creepy guy with his dog. He seemed to be walking his dog when I left for work, around 7:30, and again when she was leaving for work, around 8:30. He would let his dog out to her daily, and she would pet the dog at first. She stopped because the dog smelled so bad and the man never spoke. He just stared. She started being creeped out too. She said he seemed friendly enough until she stopped petting his dog and his stare shifted to being mean too. He began stopping to watch her drive by as well. Then one day I saw it. I saw him down out past the entrance of the neighborhood and at the tree line to the forest. He was clearly walking into the woods. That's when it clicked. Why did he wear the same clothes every day? Why he seemed to be there with his dog every day we left the house? Why did they smell so bad? Why I was hearing things in the woods? I almost began to panic. Surely a man isn't living in the woods watching me, right? Surely this man hasn't been watching me through my fence for almost a year at this point. The whole time this was happening, the house next door was empty. It was a rental and the previous tenants left and it sat. I started thinking back, and I began seeing the man sometime after the previous tenants moved out. I tried my best not to panic and started looking into trail cameras to film behind my fence. I told my roommate about my theory, and she said I sounded crazy at first. She jokingly started yelling out for him to go away and leave us alone. Then we finally started hearing footsteps in the woods at that moment and then ran inside. Before I could even order a camera, they had rented the house next door. It was just days after I told my roommate what was going on. A family with a dog and 2 kids had moved in. The last time I saw the man walking his dog was the morning the family moved in, because I came home from work to see the moving truck. When I introduced myself to the neighbors, I had asked about the woods behind the house. They didn't have a fence. I asked if they found anything back there, and they said they did, but it was just random junk they threw out. I didn't say anything more. I really contemplated telling them, but I figured I would sound insane. I believe this man was living behind their house and watching me through my fence. I never had cameras in the backyard, so I can't say for certain if he ever crossed the fence. Since I never saw him again, I decided that his cover was blown and he had moved on to watch other people. I stayed in that home until October 2025. Literally never saw that guy ever again after that day. This is quite a long one, so apologies that it may take a while to tell. I do have to give a little bit of context also. I'm a 22-year-old female, but the story took place when I was 21. I live in a small town and I work in a pub in the town center. 2 pubs, 2 small shops, and a bank. On my walk home, I walk past one of the shops, which also has a small bus shelter next to it. Buses run every hour-ish, but none run after 8 p.m. After that, it's just residential housing and then my house near the end of the road. All in all, from my job and house, it's about an 8-minute walk. My town is usually dead after 10 p.m., as everything is closed, and I would genuinely say it was relatively safe. I never had a problem with walking home alone. This incident happened on New Year's Eve going into New Year's Day, so the pubs were open later. I finished my shift at about 1:30 a.m., and me, my boss, boyfriend, and 2 other coworkers went to the pub next door for a drink before we went home. It was about 2:30 a.m. when I realized what time it was and that I needed to get home. My boyfriend lives on the other side of town and I wasn't staying with him that night. My boss insisted on driving me home, and I kept insisting that he stay as everyone else was enjoying themselves and talking about the Christmas period we had at work. Same with my boyfriend. He insisted on walking me home, but I was adamant that I was fine, and it was literally less than 10 minutes. Anyway, after a lot of pushback, I told them I was walking home. I really enjoy walking without headphones, having a cigarette, especially after a shift, because it genuinely is so silent and peaceful. I didn't pass or see anybody until I got to walking past the shop. Like I mentioned previously, there's a small bus shelter next to it, and as I got closer, I realized there was a man sitting on the bench in the bus stop. Bear in mind, it is nearly 3 a.m., and even the pub we were at wasn't actually open anymore. They just let us in because we worked at the other pub. I didn't really think much of the man, but as I got closer, I realized I had served him at my shift earlier on in the night. He looked up as I was walking, and I realized he was sniffing some sort of drug from his keys, most likely cocaine. I didn't actually know who he was, and still don't, but he didn't seem threatening. He just looked like he was kind of chilling, I guess. Probably not the best choice of words. He did meet my eyes though, and I was actually walking past the bus shelter. He said something along the lines of, "Sorry, darling, do you have a lighter I can borrow?" I was smoking as I was walking, so he knew I would have one. I stopped and he was already walking towards me as I had, so I started digging one of the many lighters that I had out of my bag. I was fully intent on just letting him keep it. I'm not the type to stand with a 30-something-year-old man while he's lighting a cigarette. Then he had asked me for a cigarette, but I had just lit my last one, which I said. During this whole conversation, he was very close to me, but I was kind of frozen in place. I'd realized that I'd stopped and was standing with a man in a dead street where nobody was around. I was still in the part of town where there isn't housing for another couple of minutes, and if anyone had come out of the pub, I was too far away where they wouldn't have seen me. I just started mumbling something like, "Hey, just keep the lighter. I've got to go." But this man who I had only spoken to for about 20 seconds told me, "Wait, just stop a second." And when my feet had started to turn to walk away, I stopped again. Side note, I know I should have just walked away, but I thought maybe it was innocent enough, and I didn't want to give a reason to provoke him if I had just walked away from him. This time his demeanor switched, and he wasn't very polite to start with. But it's like him telling me to stop made him realize that I was a young woman walking alone at this time of night. I genuinely still get chills thinking about what he said. He looked me up and down, then he said, "You know, I've been real angry, and I've been waiting for someone to hurt all night. You shouldn't be walking around here alone." My legs literally turned to jelly at that moment. I didn't even know if my phone was in my pocket or in my bag. I looked around and then said, "I'm not alone. My boyfriend is waiting for me around the corner. I will be with him in a minute." Then smiled. Just a bare-faced lie. My boyfriend was still in the pub and had no clue that this interaction was going on. I thought maybe I should walk back and go back to the pub, but I just decided not to. My house is closer." The man smirked as if he knew I was chatting absolute bullshit, and he would walk with me to meet my boyfriend. There was no boyfriend waiting for me around the corner. I kept saying there was no need, but he was literally on my tail, rambling about how I don't understand him, I don't get it, I need to walk with him, that he wasn't going to hurt me. And this whole time I kept thinking he was going to grab my hair or pull me to the ground, and that any minute he was going to realize there was no boyfriend waiting for me. I ended up pulling my phone out of my pocket, and it opened to our work group chat, and I just typed a message about a man walking with me, realizing my phone was on 2%, thinking that I just wanted someone to know what was happening. I didn't dare go to call my boyfriend. This guy had started mumbling about how I wasn't listening to him. By some miracle, when we turned around the corner onto my street, the guy didn't realize my boyfriend wasn't there, or maybe he did but didn't say anything. He did up his behavior though, and he started spewing the most perverted stuff to me, saying, "You're such a pretty young girl. I bet your boyfriend doesn't know how to handle you." The whole time I wasn't speaking, just speeding up and checking my phone discreetly. I realized that he was going to know where my house was, so I just thought, I'm going to have to pretend one of these houses are mine. Otherwise, I'll be leading him right to my house where my dad would be asleep at the back of the house, none the wiser. All of the houses on the street had a small gate and footpath leading to the door, so I chose a house with the light on and opened their gate. I turned to the guy and then said, "This is my place. See you later. And thanks for walking me." Then closed the gate behind me. I ran up to their door and shoved my key into the door that wasn't mine and prayed that this guy would leave and wouldn't wait for me to go inside the house. Thankfully, he didn't, and he started stumbling in the opposite direction back down the street away from where my actual house was. And what I thought was my only chance, I opened this gate and sprinted home. This guy clocked what I was doing instantly and started walking in my direction. By the time I got to my house, he had either not caught up quick enough or had given up. When I put my key into the door, I realized my dad had left his in the door internally, meaning I was locked out. I got my phone out and realized it had died by the time we were walking, so I just started banging on the door, and luckily, my dad let me in after a couple of minutes. And that was it. But it was absolutely terrifying. I haven't walked home alone since, and my boyfriend was so upset that he didn't push more and let him walk me home. Thankfully, I'm okay, and nothing physical happened to me. When I was 11, my single mom, 9-year-old sister, and 6-year-old brother moved into a beautiful older craftsman-style house. I'd heard it was about 80 years old back then in 1984. Soon after we moved in, we found out it was infested with cockroaches. I've never seen anything like it. You'd turn on the lights at night and they'd scatter from every surface. We had to store all of our food that wasn't canned in the fridge so they wouldn't get into it. We tried bug bombs and professional exterminators numerous times with no effect. Those things can really survive a nuclear war. Anyway, they weren't the reason we lived in this house less than a year before fleeing for our lives. I just thought it was an interesting side story. To this day, roaches are near the top of my detested bugs list. I remember my mom discussing our next door neighbor's creepy son with my grandma. He was in his 20s or 30s. She'd been doing dishes one day and looked up to see him standing directly on the other side of the kitchen window staring in at her. Normally, she would have kept something scary like this from us kids. But about that time, she told us to tell her if we ever saw him near the house and we weren't allowed to play outside. She also told us about a couple of times when she woke up to see him standing over her bed, and one time he put a cloth with chemicals over her face to knock her out. This is the part of the story I know the least about, since she didn't tell us about it until years later. I think she might have thought she was dreaming, especially if he was drugging her. I don't know if anything else happened. I've never asked her about it in case something did and it brought up bad memories. So one afternoon we were all doing some spring cleaning when my brother said he had found a cigarette butt in the upstairs toilet. Weird since nobody in our family smokes. Being a dumb little 6-year-old, he flushed it before telling our mom. I still remember her trying to get the entire story out of him, being upset that the evidence was gone and thinking he might have been mistaken or maybe he picked up a butt somewhere outside out of curiosity. She soon dropped it and we mostly forgot about it. I think it was a few weeks later, My brother was spending the night at our grandparents', and my sister and I were the only ones upstairs. Our mom's bedroom was downstairs. My sister heard a sound like a screen door slamming, but she insisted it came from in the house, and she was freaked out. I told her it was just from outside and to go to sleep. A minute later, we heard a strangled cough coming from just outside our bedroom door. A man's cough, and it sounded like he was trying to keep from making noise. I whispered that we needed to get downstairs immediately. We sneaked out of the room, and I had the irrational urge to turn on the light in the bathroom, which was just across the hall from our bedroom, and check to see if anyone was there. Then just as strong of a feeling to get away from the bathroom and get downstairs now. The scariest moment of my life was when we were creeping down the stairs in the pitch black. It was a spiral enclosed stairway with walls, the perfect place for someone to hide. The stairway light was burned out and the wood steps were creaky, so it was terrifying making our way down. We got downstairs and woke up our mom, panicked that there was a guy upstairs in our bathroom. She started to tell us to just go back to bed, but could see we were seriously scared. She went over to the bottom of the stairway to go up and show us that there was nothing to be scared about. Then she had just as strong of a feeling to close the stairway door and lock it immediately. She did call the cops. They found nothing and didn't really take us seriously. The next day, she called a PD detective friend of hers from high school to come over and inspect the house. Remembering the cigarette butt in the toilet, she had him look at the upstairs bathroom window. It was a high, narrow rectangular window, not very big, but just wide enough for a person. Who knows how many times the intruder climbed our roof to get in and was upstairs while we were sleeping across the hall. The window swung up on hinges. When my mom's friend let the window drop, it sounded like a screen door slamming. He said the locks on all the windows were so old they were practically useless, and we needed to get out of this house right away. We moved into my grandparents' house that same day. When my mom went with her brothers a few days later to pack up some things, a back door had been smashed open, but nothing in the house was disturbed. Edit to clarify why it seems like my mom was in denial about the guy going into her room. I'm honestly not really clear on the details since she never told us about what she saw. I think she might have been out of it because of the chloroform and probably thought she was imagining it or something. The puzzle pieces came into place after the detective checked out our house and confirmed someone was breaking in. As soon as she knew we were in real danger, she got us out immediately. A few years later, we heard the neighbor's son was actually arrested for rape and attempted murder. I still wonder what might have happened if I had turned on that bathroom light, if my mom didn't lock the stairway door, or if we didn't leave the house when we did. I also wonder if it's still infested with cockroaches. Update. My mom got back to me. She said that she only remembers seeing him in her room one time and felt like she was struggling to stay awake. Another time, she didn't clearly wake up but felt like she was trying to get something off her mouth. That's all she can remember. So I did get the details a little wrong in my memory. It's no wonder she didn't think anything was wrong at first if she only thought they were dreams. The cigarette butt was a clue, and what my sister and I heard was proof. I have to say, as a single mom myself, I can only imagine how freaked out my mom must have been when her friend told her we needed to get out immediately. The story I'm about to tell is probably a lot less scary than many stories on this forum, but it was actually kind of traumatizing to me. This is a few years ago, so I'm sure I've left out some details and events. Please excuse my English. This happened in the summer of 2016 when I was 24 and my husband was 29. We had 2 years prior moved to a European capital, and it was a real struggle to find a place to live. So we were living about an hour outside the city until the owner decided to sell his apartment and we had to find a new place. We were really lucky and we found this great apartment right in the middle of the city center. The rent was quite high, and despite the fact that we were trying to save up to buy our own place, we decided it was worth it. The first 2 weeks were awesome. After we had been living in the suburbs for 2 years, we now had everything just outside of our building. My office was in walking distance and there were plenty of shops, restaurants, and nightclubs. One evening after work, we were chilling at home watching a movie when we became aware of someone screaming and singing songs with extremely violent Nazi content. We were looking out our window trying to locate the noise, but couldn't exactly figure out where it came from other than from inside the courtyard that was surrounded by several buildings and a lot of apartments. So we finally gave up and just shut the window so we could have some peace. Suddenly, we hear a loud knock on our door. Kind of startled, we both went to open, thinking this was either the police or some neighbors who were also bothered by the absurd singing and screaming. We opened the door and a man in his late 30s was looking back at us. He was probably about my height, 5'8", a bit chubby and bald, and looked relatively normal. I later learned that this guy had been quite a famous child actor and had been in several movies up until his early 20s. Because he didn't look crazy and appeared relatively calm, we figured he was just another neighbor trying to locate the noise. This neighbor lived in the apartment next to us. The building was L-shaped, and if we wanted to, we could look directly into his apartment from our windows. He then proceeded to accuse us of filming him through our window, and we were so confused. We had been in our windows a lot this evening trying to locate the commotion, but we had never recorded anything, and why would we record his apartment? He now had this crazy look in his eyes, and he was saying all kinds of crazy stuff that I have now forgotten, but it was some kind of insane Nazi conspiracy theory stuff, and we were of course sent by someone to come and harm him. That's when we realized that this is the guy behind the obscene singing and screaming. As he was getting more and more agitated, he had tried to enter our apartment, but my husband shoved him out and closed and locked the door. We heard him walk into his apartment and slam the door. For some days, maybe a week, we didn't hear or see anything of this neighbor, but we did see some strange drug addict type of people coming and going from his apartment. Then the singing and screaming started again. This happened at all times, but especially at night when we were trying to sleep. We almost went crazy, but because it's so hard to find a place to live in the city, and because we really hate moving, we just put up with it. Later one afternoon, I felt this burning smell, and I went out in the hallway to try and figure out where it came from. And together with another neighbor, we quickly found out that it came from the Nazi guy's apartment. We tried knocking, but no one answered. We tried peeking through his mail slot, but saw nothing except for smoke. We obviously called the fire department, who came and knocked down his door to find him sleeping naked with something burning on the stove. They put the small fire out, he apologized, and I don't think anything else ever came of it. Of course, though, he continued to sing and scream Nazi songs and racial stuff, but we were now also introduced to wolf howling. It sounded totally crazy. Even with our window shut, we could still hear him. Some more time passed, and one night before we were going to bed, my husband felt a burning smell. We immediately suspected the smell to come from his apartment yet again, and we were just about to dial the fire department when we heard this loud bang in the courtyard. We looked out and could see the Nazi guy throwing out his belongings and furniture from his windows into the courtyard. And not only this, but his apartment was in flames. We were panicking because the hallway was starting to fill with smoke, and we didn't want to die from inhaling the toxic smoke on our way down from the 3rd floor. We grabbed our stuff, and my husband went knocking on all of the doors to get our neighbors out. He didn't get any answer from the crazy guy's apartment, and together with another neighbor came up with the brilliant idea of breaking in to rescue the Nazi guy. They finally managed to knock on the door, covered their faces with some clothing, and went in. They couldn't find the guy, and they had to give up and run out before there was just too much smoke. Shortly after, the fire rescuers came and put out the fire, but they also couldn't find anybody in the Nazi guy's apartment. He went missing for some time, until eventually he showed up trying to get into his apartment. The locks had been changed at this point, and the police were still investigating. He had actually started the fire and then left his apartment, apparently trying to burn down the whole building with all of the neighbors asleep. He was later on charged with arson, but managed to run away and didn't show up in court. We moved away shortly after, so I'm not sure what happened to this guy, if he ever did time in prison, but when I Google his name, it looks like he's still living in the same apartment. I also found several stories about him online and police reports, so he's obviously a guy with a lot of issues. Too bad he has to involve other innocent people. Okay, so I'm a long-time lurker here, and this is my first post on this sub. Throwaway because obvious reasons. After reading someone else's story, it reminded me about this one. I apologize in advance if this isn't written to perfection. I'm a very detailed-oriented person, so there might be a lot of parentheses further explaining stuff. I honestly don't even remember the guy's name, so we'll just call him Creeper Joe. This happened a good 7 years ago toward the end of high school for me. Anyway, this is my old neighbor's son who was in at least his mid-30s, and he still lived at home with his completely able and mostly sane 70-something-year-old mother. He's moderately overweight, deathly pale, and a ginger. No offense to gingers, obviously, but that coupled with never seeing daylight made him almost translucent. He also always wore stained clothes, and he didn't have very good hygiene at all. Anyway, I didn't see him very often. He would stay inside and not leave his house for weeks, if not months on end. He had no job, no friends, nothing. We'd occasionally catch each other getting the mail or something, so he'd strike up a conversation, usually about metal because he'd often hear my music coming from my room. I left my windows open a lot while I was at home because I liked the fresh air. So we'd awkwardly talk for a few minutes and then just go back to our respective houses. I figured he was just lonely, so I didn't actively try to avoid him. My dad hangs out in the garage and a lot with the door open, having some beers with friends, working on cars, etc. One day he told me to stay clear of Creeper Joe because he saw him looking at our neighbor's kids a lot, mainly this kid Isaac across the street. He was a few years younger than me, so he was probably about 13 or 14 or so at the time, I think. Anyway, I just tried to avoid him a little bit at that point because it kind of weirded me out. A few months go by without incident, and my dad comes into the house visibly uneasy. My mom and I ask him what's wrong, and he says the neighbor Creepy Joe just told him that he likes little boys. My mom and I are obviously distressed at that statement as well. So we talk to him and tell him that he needs to call the cops or something, especially after we noticed him checking out our neighbor's kids. So he calls the cops anonymously a few days later. They show up at the house and seize his computer and all other electronics as well. They, of course, found child porn. I don't remember him being arrested, but I do remember not seeing him for a while again after that. So I'm not entirely sure whatever happened with that. When I did see him again, he actually seemed to avoid me in the sense that if I was outside getting mail, he'd wait until I went inside to get his. I didn't want anything to do with him at that point, so I didn't really care and just went about my business as usual. Several months go by, and then there's an ambulance at the house. I thought maybe his mom was having issues, but nope. Turns out Creeper Joe kicked the bucket. And apparently his mother only even realized it after 3 fucking days, and only because she put a meal in the microwave and he never came out and got it. Which means that for him to not even leave his room for several days at a time was a common enough occurrence for her to not be alarmed. Not to shower, not to use the restroom, etc. I can't even begin to imagine how gross his room must have been. She also evidently had taken out a life insurance claim on him for a pretty good chunk of money. Enough for her to redo her entire kitchen and live comfortably from then on out. Why she had life insurance on him, I have no idea. He didn't do anything. No job, no dangerous hobbies, he wasn't even her caretaker. She still took care of him at this point, so it was all pretty oddly suspicious. Also, supposedly, according to the autopsy, he died of a heart attack. To this day, all of the neighbors still have suspicions about the mother. Nothing would have seemed weird if it wasn't for the random life insurance on a guy whose biggest posed risk was losing the remote. While it may not have been as close a call as the other stories posted here, the whole thing creeps me the hell out. This occurred in the winter of 2013 when I was 21 and in the military. I'm a petite female for context, and I have the appearance of looking younger than I actually am. A little backstory. At this point in time, I had been in the military for a little over 2 years, my first duty station being in Detroit. I had lived off base and at first lived in a township north of Detroit where my apartment was broken into. I woke up to my door handle being completely disassembled and my car was broken into, although that was partly my fault since my car at the time had manual locks and I might have had a back door unlocked the night it was broken into. After those events, I decided to move since my lease was up, and I chose a gated community even further north/northwest into a different township. I lived on my own the entire time I was stationed in Detroit, which always kept me on edge because SVU and CSI really messed with my trust of strangers. Anyway, the new place was super nice and affordable. And even though it wasn't completely secure as far as a literal gate surrounding the apartments, residents had to have a pass to even drive through the community. And visitors had to check in with security before being allowed on the premises. And I felt way safer at this new place than my prior residence. The apartments were set up to have 4 units per housing building, and the front doors leading into each of the apartments were on the outside. Due to this, each door had a light next to it, so when you checked your people, you could see who's there. That's important for later. Our duty rotation was similar to a firefighter's duty rotation, where we would stay in duty for 2 days and have sliding weekends. Duty every other weekend, meaning it's a pretty predictable schedule. This will come into play later. I'm super introverted and I keep to myself most of the time, but I am friendly when I meet new people, etc., but never one to make best friends with the neighbors. So when I first moved in summer of 2012, I had a neighbor next to me on the 2nd level and one below me on the 1st level. But over the next 2 months, they moved out and I was alone in my housing building, which I would be lying if I said that didn't give me anxiety a bit. Fast forward to December 2012 and our duty rotation had a complete overhaul, making it a little less predictable. We would stay in duty for a day and overnight, and the next day work until 1400 and go home for the next 2 days. Over the holidays, my then boyfriend visited me from out of state. We were doing a distance relationship, so we barely saw each other. A week later, I was taking out my garbage to the dumpster and collecting my mail. Once I unlocked my mailbox by the dumpster and turned around, there was a guy standing around 30 feet behind me just staring at me. I was startled because it was broad daylight, and I didn't see him when I was walking to the dumpster/mailbox area. He's dressed in black pants and a black hoodie and larger than me, so I would have seen him or heard him at least. I just stand there not making a move, and he says,
"Hi, I'm Jim. How are you?"
So I introduce myself and he asked if I'm in the military because he's seen me in some type of uniform. So I say yes and that I'm in a branch here. He then makes me super weirded out by mentioning my schedule.
"I've noticed your work schedule is different. You used to come home every 2 days. Now it's like every other day. Is that going to be the new normal for you?"
So my Spidey Chris Hansen senses kick in, and I just say, "Oh no, that's just the new holiday routine schedule they have me on. We will be having a completely different one in the coming weeks." Bold-faced lie. That actually was the new normal, but he didn't need to know that. I then receive a trailing,
"Oh,"
from him. Then he asks,
"Was that guy who was around you over the last week a family member?"
To which I reply that he's my boyfriend and former military, and that's how we met, taking care to not mention he lived in a completely different state. Jim doesn't say anything, and I want to scram before anything crazy happens, so I just say it's nice to meet him, and then he says,
"If you want to come to my apartment sometime, feel free to. I live in the 1st floor unit right over there. My buddy who's in a different branch is over, and we're going to watch Star Wars."
The unit he lived on was the unit directly across from mine, but with a parking lot in between them. So I turn it down even though I love Star Wars, and I say my farewell. I felt weird about it, but went about my day, and over time it left my mind. Another fast forward to the end of January 2013. I was leaving work for the day after my duty day, and one of my friends asked if I wanted to join him and another mutual friend at a bar later on for a beer and karaoke. Of course, I'm down. This person is my best friend, and it's really depressing in the dirty deed during the winter months, so it would lift my mood. From here on out, we'll call my friend Tom. Tom was working in the galley at this time and didn't have to stay on duty, but he planned to meet me in my apartment after he got off work at 5 p.m., meaning he would be at my place around 6 to 6:30. My duty section got off at 2 p.m., so I went home and chilled out on my couch for a bit. Because I stood mid-watch the night before, I was insanely tired and fell asleep on the couch probably around 3 p.m. Obviously, since it's wintertime in Detroit, the days are super short, so it gets dark around 4:30 to 5 p.m. While napping, I wake up to a knocking on my door. At first, I thought that it was a dream, so I kept snoozing. Then the knocking turned into banging, and half awake, half asleep, I look at my phone and see that it's 5 p.m. No way is it my friend, and besides, even if it was, he usually calls my phone if I didn't answer my door right away. In my utter exhaustion, I blow it off and fall back to the snooze. I then wake up to my phone going off, and it's my friend Tom. I pick up and he says he's there and to answer the door. I go to my people completely paranoid, and I see that the area is completely black. So I call Tom back and ask if he can start talking at my door because I can't see that it's him. He does. I open it, and he asked what happened to the light and why was it off. I had no idea why my external door light was not on, and we go to fix it. Lo and behold, the bulb was twisted to make it turn off. We twist it back to the on position, and I explain what happened earlier, finding the events of the day pretty shady. Right away, I didn't think that it might have been Jim, but it would make sense if it was. He gave me weird vibes, and after that, I didn't feel comfortable in my apartment and couldn't wait to leave. Side note, I watched that episode of Criminal Minds where the serial killers twist the light bulb to the off position of their victims' outer lights like 2 weeks after this happened to me. It gave me chills, and when I received orders 2 months later, I took them without ever looking back.
My name's Ryan, and I'm a grad student here in NYC, and I just managed to escape from the worst roommate I've ever had. I've been a fan of the show for a while now, and I've always kind of hoped that I'd never have a reason to contribute. I thought I could just listen to everyone else's creepy stories and never experience one of my own, but I guess that all changed when I met Kurt. I won't bore you with all the ins and outs of my housing situation in September last year, but let's just say that I needed a place to stay, and I needed it badly. And so I ended up going to view a single room in a shared apartment where my roomie would be a guy called Kurt. And Kurt wasn't there during the viewing, and I'm guessing that not only was that on purpose, but the landlord had the place scrubbed down to make it look like a regular, sane person lived there. After some couch surfing, I moved in on a 6-month contract starting October 1st of last year, and when I first met Kurt, I had absolutely no measure of what a creep he was going to be. He seemed like a quiet guy, into his old-school heavy metal with his long red hair and beard, and I honestly figured the only issue might be loud music or something like that. But pretty quickly, Kurt showed his character. And the first thing, and probably the least creepy thing relative to everything else, was his music. He played bass guitar, and at first me and him were pretty cool, so I asked him what band he was into after hearing him play one day. Now, he was into much more extreme stuff, but we talked about bands like Sabbath, Zeppelin, and my personal favorite, AC/DC, for a while, and it was cool to find some shared interests. But then, Kurt asked if I wanted to listen to something he wrote. Now, I responded saying, sure, go ahead, and then he gets out his phone and starts playing this recording that's just his bass line and a drum track. It sounded pretty cool at first, like kind of creepy sounding, but still pretty good, and it kind of reminded me of Dawn Patrol by Megadeth, if you know the song. Some vocals kicked in, something kind of weird sounding I had to almost concentrate on to hear. But then I realized I wasn't hearing anyone singing. It sounded like a young woman talking, and she sounded very upset. I figured it was some kind of spoken word thing that he was working on with someone, but then, as the girl kept on talking, I realized that she was the survivor of a violent, carnal assault, and that she was recounting her experiences either in court or some kind of police tape. I said, dude, is it real? And not like a sort of, oh man, that's cool kind of way, like, what the F kind of way. But Kurt just smiled and nodded and then started telling me about the exact crime it was from and things like that. I didn't say it to his face, but I thought using that audio was in very, very poor taste. But like I said, I didn't want to start an argument or cause any tension. And so I just palmed him off with something like, good art is always provocative, I guess, and then turned our talk onto something else. I only had to live with the guy, and I didn't think his weird taste in tunes meant that he was a serial killer or anything like that, but then I guess in that department, the thing he did next did him no favors. So I come home, I'm hungry, I open the fridge, and there's a bunch of what looks like organ meats in unlabeled jars, and the whole fridge stinks like vinegar. I felt like his stepdad or something going up to his room and asking him, like, hey buddy, what's that you left in the refrigerator there? It's awfully stinky for shared food storage, don't you think? Now Kurt's just sitting there, blasted out of his skull and listening to the Melvins. And while yes, the Melvins rule, they don't pair well with pickled organ meats. Kurt apologized, told me they were sort of not-so-live models for an art project that he was working on, and said that he'd have them out of the fridge by the end of the week. Again, this wasn't so bad because while it wasn't nice looking at a shriveled-up pig's heart every time I grabbed some creamer, it wasn't affecting my quality of life or anything like that. But then, come the end of the week, the way Kurt chose to dispose of those organs pushed things to a whole other level. I woke up to take a leak at about 4 o'clock in the morning, and I had to be up at 6:30, so I'm pissed that I'm actually losing out on sleep. I hit the upstairs hallway in my boxers, breathing through my nose, all half asleep, and then, bam, this smell like sour death just punches me in the nose. I can hear frying coming from downstairs, and so I kind of knew what Kurt was doing before I saw it. But I went down anyway to make sure, and when I saw him frying those pickled organs in a goddamn pan, I said, "Dude, what the actual F are you doing right now?" Again, Kurt was all apologies like he always was. I promise that's not a Nirvana reference, but that time I was actually pissed off. Because once I went back up to bed, all I could smell was that sour death smell after it had gotten into my room. I couldn't go back to sleep at all. Like half because of the smell and half because of how mad I was that he'd try and cook that crap at 4 in the goddamn morning. It made him sick too, like he pretty much occupied the bathroom for the next 48 hours, meaning that I was relegated to peeing in bottles whenever he was camped out in there or whenever I was too scared to witness the aftermath. And that kind of knocked the pep out of him for a while, I suppose, because there was no more weird behavior out of Kurt, at least none I could see. Now, the next thing happened maybe 2 or 3 weeks later when I came home to find a piece of meat hanging from some string he had tied to a cabinet handle, just sort of hanging there over the workspace. It didn't have a hook going through it like you might be imagining. It was sort of all wrapped up and tied in a string, but then the string had little tiny pieces of metal hooked on them, and so the meat looked like it had maybe 4 or 5 of these little metal tags on it. Each tag had weird little symbols on it that was different to the others. Now right away I'm thinking, Kurt, what the hell, man? And while I wanted to just toss it because it was a freaking dripping onto the counter, I just wrapped it up in plastic and put it in the fridge for him. Kurt comes home asking why I moved his meat and then asked me not to do it again because he was curing it. I asked him if he put any salt on it, like fully knowing that he didn't because I saw it, and when he said no, I said he needed to put a lot of salt on it if he wanted to cure it. Now he says, "Oh, okay, thanks." And then when I visit the kitchen, there it is again. No salt, no rub, no nothing. It's just there. I looked up how to cure meat, and what I read says you actually do gotta put it in the fridge while it's salted, and so at that point I'm thinking, okay, why the hell is he lying to me? I didn't want to argue with him. I like the quiet life, you know? And so instead of actually telling him what a disgusting creep he was being with his little Hellraiser ornament, I very politely suggested that he keep his meat in his bedroom so he wasn't making the kitchen unsanitary. I also added that he was going to make it a safety issue. I had no choice but to contact the landlord. I wasn't a dick about it. It was more like, just work with me, dude. And since he wasn't a total a-hole, Kurt agreed to do just that and keep his meat in his room. The final straw was when the smell of rotten meat started seeping out from under his bedroom door. And then it wasn't long before I noticed an uptick of flies in our apartment. I got in touch with the landlord and asked him to perform some kind of apartment inspection so he could personally tell Kurt to stop just letting raw meat rot in his bedroom. He said he was busy for a couple of days and he would be over the first chance he got. But before then, I realized why the apartment was starting to smell worse and worse. It wasn't just seeping out from Kurt's door. He was hiding pieces of it around the apartment and letting it rot. He didn't get violent or yell at me when I confronted him about it. He gave me some evil-looking death stare, but he didn't say anything. He just slammed his bedroom door in my face, told me he didn't want to talk to me anymore, and at that I called the landlord again and told him not to bother coming over, or at least not on my behalf anyways, because I wanted out. I still had to pay him a month's rent at the start of this month, but I honestly thought it was worth it just to get away from Kurt in that apartment. I think he's a scumbag because I figured that he deliberately hid Kurt's character from me, who, by the way, was having his rent paid by his goddamn parents. I also used to wonder how he could afford to live there without any discernible source of income, but on the way out, the landlord mentioned it and it all suddenly made sense. The same landlord actually offered me an alternative place to stay, but there was no way in hell that I was about to trust him again. Not after he basically tricked me into living with a freak like Kurt. So let me tell you a story about how the best living situation I ever had turned into the worst living situation I ever had, and why there's never been a truer statement than never judge a book by its cover. So many moons ago now, I was looking for places to live in the city I'm at when I came across this pretty amazing apartment while going through the listings. The decor is awesome, it's all furnished, and it was maybe 15 minutes walk away from my job too, so literally perfect in almost every possible way. The only drawback was that it was a shared apartment. Now, I wasn't completely averse to living with someone, but I also knew that if there was a clash of personalities or something like that, then things could get pretty tense pretty quick. I'd previously lived with a guy, I'm a guy myself by the way, who could only be safely described on YouTube as a Neolithic savage, because if I go into any detail I'll probably get this video flagged if you actually read it. Now my point is, I knew that there was no point in me living in that place if the roomie was going to be difficult, and so I asked the landlord if I could meet him during the viewing, and that is how I met Todd. And Todd seemed like the dream roommate, honestly. He said he worked a lot and that he liked going to the gym and all of that in his spare time, but when he said that he'd be out of the apartment a lot, he wasn't kidding. I had the whole place to myself pretty much all day, every day, and the only times that I'd catch him chilling on the couch was when the game was on or when he had an injury or something like that. But even when he was home, I was stoked to have him around. He was a funny guy, he was clean, and he was chill too, so generally nice and easy to live with. But then came the night when everything changed. So the place had these 2 big bedrooms, these ensuite bathrooms, the works. Mine had a lock on the door too, but I didn't think that I'd need it, you know? Todd was a respectful and mature enough person to knock before entering and whatnot, so while I briefly considered using the lock, in the end I was sort of thinking, why bother? Now anyways, I've been living there for just over a month with absolutely 0 complaints all around, and the whole time, Todd was the ideal roomie. But then one night, I woke up needing to pee in the middle of the night like usual, and when I rolled over in bed, all I could see was this dark figure standing by the open doorway. And I freaking screamed so loud. I pretty much dived backwards off the bed, still screaming at the top of my lungs. Then, by the time I grabbed the little folding knife I kept in the drawer, Todd had switched on the light. It was him, standing there in his underwear, but as weird as it might sound, he was just as surprised as I was. You see, Todd wasn't aware that he'd got up out of bed and walked into my bedroom because he'd been sleepwalking. Now, I said he probably should have just told me that once I'd moved in, but as it turned out, Todd hadn't done any sleepwalking for years. He said he used to do it a bunch when he was a kid, especially after he and his family moved house one time, and he figured it was probably the change of me moving in having triggered it or something, and said that he'd never had neglected to mention it if he'd been actively sleepwalking. I just wanted to get to sleep, honestly, so I just told him everything was fine and then went back to bed. Now, the next morning, I texted him to say basically, hey, sorry if that was weird, and I'm sorry about your condition coming back. I hope everything's okay. He told me we were good, but that maybe I should start locking my door in the future. I texted him back saying, sure thing, Captain Obvious, with maybe a laughing emoji, and then we were pals again. Now from then on, I started locking my door at night, but it also wasn't like Todd wasn't doing anything about it. He said he went to some doctor who gave him a prescription for mild sleeping pills, and then for about a week or so there was nothing. And then one night, I'm asleep in bed and I hear bang, 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 bang on my bedroom door. Now once again, I'm just about jumping out of bed, but since Todd's knocking, I figured that he must be awake, so I asked him what's up. But I get 0 response. I knew he must have been sleepwalking, so I called out to him to say, Hey, wake up! All that kind of stuff, but again, I got no reply. I got up out of bed thinking, please don't make this a regular thing. And then when I opened up the door, there's Todd, buck naked, with his eyes all rolled up in their sockets so all I could see was the whites. I yelled something, slammed the door, and I think that's what woke him up because the next thing I hear is him saying sorry and then running back to his room, still apologizing. I didn't follow him. I was mad, but what the hell could I do? The guy had some serious condition. It wasn't really his fault. And so I went back to sleep, went to work the next morning, and then called Todd at lunch to see how he was doing. He kept apologizing for waking me up, but I made it clear that as long as he was seeking help, then it was fine, because sooner or later the issue would be resolved, and that's aside from the fact that he couldn't really help it. He was super grateful, which was fine, because what choice did I have other than to work with him, and then again, that same sort of pattern played itself out. He went to the doctor, got more powerful sleeping pills, and even started hammering cardio at the gym after work to really tire himself out, you know? And there were another couple of weeks without incidents, and then, once again, I woke up to Todd banging on my door in the middle of the night. I was just getting so tired of it by then. Almost every time we thought he'd handled it, it came back all over again. I started to suspect that he might not be sleepwalking, and that this was sort of like a weird way of trying to force me out. But I guess that was my paranoia and exhaustion talking because, well, I guess you'll soon see. And so he bangs on my door, wakes me up, and I start telling him to wake up and go back to bed. I put my head back down on the pillow, and he didn't knock again, but I also didn't hear him wake up or walk back to his room, so I got up, walked to the door, and started listening out for him. I figured that he might have maybe quickly walked off to another part of the house, but I also didn't want to just open my door up just in case he was standing there naked again. And so as I said, I listened. And what I heard sent a chill run through me. Todd was standing on the other side of the door, all right, and I knew that, because he was whispering something. I knew it was just his unconscious brain working, and that what he was saying probably didn't mean a thing, but just hearing him whispering on the other side of the door gave me the creeps, big time. I ended up waking him up by banging on the door back at him, and it sucked to hear him get scared and frightened, but at least it let me know that he was for real. I started questioning why him knocking on my door didn't wake him up, but me knocking back at him did. But I guess it was sort of like the outside stimulus throwing him off his sleep rhythm or something, because, like I said, I don't suspect him of faking this anymore. Now anyway, the final time it happened, before I started to consider just leaving at the end of that month, I recorded it to show Todd that next morning, and I guess just so he could see things from my perspective. Now he started hammering on my door again, and I tried waking him up by banging back, but for some reason that didn't work, and he started whispering again. Now I banged a second time, thinking another round of knocking back might do the trick, but all that did was make Todd start speaking louder, and it was then that I heard what he was saying for the first time, and it was almost like a prayer, but all kinds of jumbled. There was a lot of, "Our Heavenly Father, Lord, hallowed be thy name," but none of it actually went anywhere. It was all these phrases just sort of looping and spiraling until it sounded almost like nonsense talk, just like an edge of reason to it. Now he spoke in this weird voice too, like in the back of his throat almost, and I honestly think that it was one of the single creepiest things I've ever heard in my life. If I just woke up to that on the first night it happened, then I'd have been even more spooked than when Todd just appeared in my room. But since I kind of knew what was happening, I just went back to bed with a pillow wrapped around my head and tried to get some sleep. Now the next morning before I left for work, I showed him the video I took the previous night. It obviously didn't show much of him, but it captured all the creepy-sounding nonsensical prayers that he recited in the back of his throat voice of his. I massively regret showing him that video, and I didn't do it to be mean or anything like that. I just needed him to see how serious it was and how bad he was disturbing my sleep. But oh man, the second he heard himself, it was like the stuffing had been knocked out of him. He went quiet. He said sorry, and then after telling him I'd see him later and we could talk about it after work, I figured that he'd head out the door like he usually did. Only he didn't. He just sat down at the kitchen table and he started to cry. Now, later that day, I got a text from Todd saying that he was checking himself into some kind of medical facility and that he might not be back for a month or two, maybe more. I had the apartment all to myself for a while, which was nice in a way, but I was really worried about Todd. We kept in touch, and I'd ask him how his treatment was going and all of that, but he'd always give me one-word answers and then change the subject like he didn't want to talk about it. Now, I remember thinking it probably wasn't going well since he didn't want to talk about it much, and then, after 2 months, Todd told me that he wouldn't be moving back to live with me, and he'd be sending someone over to gather his stuff. It was sad, knowing this super capable guy was having such trouble with a medical condition. I mean, it was creepy as hell being in the middle of all of that, and I think it'd have been a hell of a lot more frightening if I didn't know what was going on. But I did, and there was a rational explanation for it. It just sucked it was happening to him, and I lost his number after losing my phone, so these days I can't reach out to see how he's doing. So Todd, buddy, if you just so happen to be listening to this somehow, I hope you're doing much better, and I still think about you from time to time. Grief can do some strange things to people. That's what I was always told anyway. My mom first told me that when one of my high school friends lost her sister and started dressing up and acting like her sister. It made sense to me then, and I went out of my way to befriend her. Now, we're still close BFFs to this day, incidentally, and that's relevant to the story because she's a bit of a Let's Read fangirl, and she's the one who encouraged me to write in with this tale. Now, don't worry, she won't mind that I've included the personal little bit about her. She's proofreading and approving the whole thing, by the way. Now, this incident happened when I was 19. I've taken a year out after high school before going to college so I could work and put together some savings to avoid my student loans from being sky high. It didn't really work, but at least I tried. Now, this was back in I think maybe 2012 when Facebook was still really popular. We had a local neighborhood watch. I wasn't really a member as such. I didn't go to meetings or get involved, but I was their honorary mascot, which meant that I was a member of the Facebook group. Now, one day, I logged on to find the group totally abuzz. A whole bunch of the neighbors had witnessed something straight out of a horror movie, apparently. As the previous night, an elderly woman had been walking up and down the street, pushing an industrial-style shopping cart. No harm done, right? Well, the shopping cart contained a full-sized coffin. And she wasn't just walking down the street once. She was walking down the street, disappearing for a while, and then walking back the way she came. One of the neighbors, a night owl guy that I knew, his name was James, decided to follow her at a distance. He discovered that she had been walking in a circle around a few blocks and then turning around at a certain point and repeating the circuit in reverse. Everyone's posts were rife with speculation. Why was she carting a coffin around? Was that even legal? Apparently it looked like a fairly battered, dirty coffin, and some of the theories were wild. Now, it took me, a 19-year-old girl, to provide a grounded suggestion. It was a Halloween prop. It was the start of October, so it wasn't out of the ordinary. Now, James immediately shot my idea down. I hadn't seen her. Why would this extremely elderly lady be walking a circuit around the block with a spirit Halloween coffin in a shopping cart? That's a good point, James, but had he considered dementia? Maybe the old lady lived on the next street over and she was suffering from sundown syndrome, which causes dementia sufferers to start acting weird right after nightfall. It was as good an explanation as any. But whatever. It had happened, it was over, and I guess we'd never know, I said. But wrong. I was very wrong. And the next night, the old woman was back, walking her little loops, and this time, James called me up. Now, I'm sure he'd been waiting for an excuse to call me. The guy actually did have a crush on me since middle school, and he told me to look out my window. Now, sure enough, the old woman was there, and she was really, really old. I was amazed that she had the strength to push a shopping cart around at all, let alone one with a coffin in it. And she wasn't pushing it slowly either. She was striding around like a woman half her age. Now, one thing I noticed that nobody else had seemed to pick up on was that this coffin really did not look like some spirit Halloween prop. If so, it was the most realistic prop I'd ever seen, and it looked a lot more like a film or TV prop than anything else. At least it couldn't be a real coffin, could it? Now, this whole fiasco went on for another few days. I was on vacation from work, so I was happy to play night owl for a while, and then, that Sunday night, the elderly woman didn't show up. I breathed a sigh of relief, and perhaps this was the end of it. No. The next day, Monday, she was back, and I couldn't help but notice that the coffin was starting to look a little worse for the wear. It had been raining almost constantly for a week, mostly some light rain but heavier in the daytime, and I wondered if she'd been storing the coffin outside because it certainly looked like the wood was starting to get mold and splinter a little bit. Tuesday came and went, and I saw her again. Now the old woman was starting to fall apart. I really started to pay attention to her appearance. She looked almost confused and scared. Her gait, which had been strong to start with, was really starting to falter, and I was beginning to be more and more convinced that this was dementia. Now, the rest of the neighborhood watch seemed hesitant to get involved, even James. I think he even spooked them out a little. When I kept insisting that we should do something, the adults kept telling me to leave it. She wasn't doing any harm, and there must be a good explanation for it. Now, a far cry from the first night, which had set the whole of the neighborhood watch abuzz. On Wednesday, the woman was really struggling. I'd become used to her role by now, and by my reckoning, it was taking her about twice as long to do her route. Now on Thursday, she was struggling even further because one of the wheels on her shopping cart had gone all gimpy, and she really had to struggle to keep it straight. On Friday night, I decided I was going to go outside and actually approach her. Now, my parents were away for the weekend. I didn't tell anyone about what I was going to do, as she was an elderly woman who must have been in at least her mid-80s. What was the worst she could do? And so I left my house shortly before I knew that she'd show up and pretended I was outside having a smoke, and I bumped into her by complete accident. It was very clear to me that she was confused. She kept calling me Gloria, which isn't even slightly my name, but eventually I managed to persuade her to open up, and the story she told me was heartbreaking and tragic. The old woman used to live somewhere around here with her husband many years ago. He'd passed sometime in the 80s, and they'd frequently gone for evening walks around the block, and she had it in her mind that if she started taking those long walks again, she might be able to reconnect with him. At first, her story brought me to tears. The whole thing was so tragic, and she reminded me much of my great-grandma, who had succumbed to Alzheimer's when I was younger, and I wanted to hug the old woman, who told me her name was Ethel, but it felt like it'd be intrusive. Now, I was so focused on the story that she told me that I almost forgot about the coffin itself. And suddenly it struck me. She was walking the neighborhood to reconnect with her husband, but she was carting this coffin around. It couldn't be, could it? I allowed myself to actually look at the coffin. Now, I'd been avoiding looking the whole time, as I suspected that the wood had started rotting into places, and there were a couple of holes in the coffin lid that had led me into the interior. Thankfully, I couldn't see much, but I could see enough. There definitely was some type of bones in that coffin. My hands started shaking, and I told Ethel to wait where she was because I wanted to help her, and then I stepped away a little, called 911, and whispered to the dispatch about what was happening. I told them that if they send the cops, please don't send them with sirens because she was a very old, vulnerable woman, and I didn't want to give her a heart attack or anything. However, it wasn't Ethel who risked having a heart attack. When I turned back to comfort her, I was absolutely horrified to see that she had opened the coffin. Years in the ground had not done her husband justice. It was mostly bones, with patches of shriveled skin in places. His clothes had all rotted off, and one thing that stuck with me was that his scalp was partially intact, and strands of hair hung down one side of his skeletal face. I almost screamed then and ran, but I didn't want to startle Ethel. She seemed so proud to be showing off her husband, as if opening the coffin to show me had suddenly reunited her with her beloved. It's very strange, this feeling of terror and revulsion and grief and sympathy all at once, but I can safely say that I've experienced that combination. I talked to Ethel for a few minutes, trying to keep my eyes off the corpse next to us, which holy hell did it reek. When the cops pulled in, without the sirens on as I requested, and I was unbelievably relieved. Everything was quiet, controlled chaos after that. They took poor Ethel away in a police car and she stayed fully silent. They called a coroner to come for the coffin and the body, and meanwhile, it all suddenly hit me and I started shivering and convulsing in shock, so I was actually carted off to a hospital eventually. It turned out that Ethel's husband's coffin had been stolen 5 years ago. Ethel was 93 at the time that I met her. It was very clear to all of us that an 88-year-old woman was not capable of exhuming a coffin and transporting it out of a graveyard. Whoever helped her has, as far as I'm aware, still never been identified. Ethel fell into a catatonic state immediately following the events. She spent some months in a nursing home, during which I visited her at least twice a week. Now, eventually pneumonia took her, and I hope she's finally reunited with her husband, who I found out was named Clive. Thankfully, I was able to find some photos of him with Ethel in her room that her granddaughter had brought for her, and it was much better a way to picture Clive than the rotting, decomposing corpse he'd been when we first met. Now, I don't think I'll ever get that sight out of my head. It was horrific, tragic, and a terrifying series of events. But it did make for one heck of a story for the Neighborhood Watch Facebook group. Do you like fire, Joel? I used to. I used to enjoy bonfires and campfires. I used to love staring into the flames and imagining I could see all kinds of magical things in them. Now, fire just fills me with fear. Not just because of one event, but because of two. They occurred a few months apart, but they are almost certainly linked. The first event happened when I was walking home from town one day. I live within walking distance of the shopping district. Yay for the UK and its tiny landmass, so walking into town was a weekly trip for me. I live in a no-through terrace street with footpaths on one end. One leads from the town/train station, and the other leads to the suburbs and further out of town. I was walking down the footpath leading to my street when I noticed a group of 3 very drunk, very loud people just ahead of me. 2 men and a woman. I could hear them over the sounds of Rammstein playing through my headphones, but I shut off my iPhone so I could hear them clearer. They were some of the most vulgar, unpleasant people I have ever had the misfortune to follow, and I prayed that they didn't stop, turn around, and see me. They were clearly 50,000 sheets to the wind, and from the sounds of their jabbering, they were looking for a fight with someone. Anyone, probably. Thankfully, they were too focused on heading to wherever to stop and turn around. As I reached the turning into my street, they crossed over to the next footpath. I watched with disgust as one of them tossed a cigarette butt into the hedge of my neighbor at the end of the street. As soon as I got home and unpacked my shopping, I headed upstairs and checked out the window. I was a little concerned about the discarded cigarette butt because it was a dry summer and the hedge had started turning brown and dry. And before I even had a chance to scope out the end of the street, I knew something was up. It looked like it was snowing, in August, and I quickly realized that ash was blowing past my window. I quickly looked out to the right and saw that flames were licking up my neighbor's hedge. I grabbed my phone and called a couple of neighbors, ones that I knew were members of the Neighborhood Watch, and then I immediately ran outside. Before I even had a chance to get halfway down the street, the entire hedge, and I'm talking an extremely large, deciduous hedge here, had caught fully ablaze. Other neighbors started emerging from their houses, and we felt helpless as we realized that there was pretty much no way to get any kind of water towards the hedge. A bunch of us had called the fire brigade, but we had to watch in horror as the fire spread across the garden and caused the large tree in the center of my neighbor's front garden to suddenly erupt into flames. Now, it seemed like it took mere seconds for the tree to turn into a smoldering, blackened trunk and dead branches. Thankfully, that killed this part of the fire, but there was still the hedge to contend with, and with the danger of the fire spreading to the house. Thankfully, the fire brigade got there and managed to control the blaze. Once things had calmed down, I drew one of the firemen aside and told him about the trio that I'd seen tossing a potentially lit cigarette butt into the hedge, as it was clear that this had caused the fire. Now, to my surprise, the fireman seemed completely disinterested. In fact, he acted like I was an annoyance or like he didn't believe me. And this really infuriated me because I guess I was a younger person at the time, and obviously young people, and when I say young, I mean mid-20s, apparently can't be taken seriously. And this event is what caused me to finally, properly join the Neighborhood Watch. I did pretty well in my first few months as a fully fledged member. I recruited other neighbors and persuaded them to join. As someone who often works nights, I kept an eye out and was able to scare off at least one or two potential vehicle vandals. I saw a guy dealing weed on the corner a few times, but I'm not that much of a narc, so I let that one be. And then, one night, I was up very late playing video games on the computer in my room at the back of the house. Now, I forget what I was playing, but it must have been something quiet because, despite wearing headphones, I was able to hear what sounded like fireworks coming from outside. Now, it wasn't remotely fireworks season, and when I heard a second bang, I realized that it sounded more like a gunshot than a firework, but not quite that either. I climbed over my bed and peered out the window. A disturbing orange glow was coming from the back garden of one of the houses on my side of the street, right at the end. Now, at first, I wasn't sure what I was seeing until I heard another explosion and a pillar of flame shot up into the air. Immediately, I called the fire brigade and then the leader of the neighborhood watch. I still wasn't sure which garden was on fire. My friends live at the penultimate house in the terrace, and I was worried it was their garden. I ran outside and was surprised to discover I was alone. The first thing I did was run to the end of the street, and that's when I realized that it was the side garden of the final house in the row, number 20, which was on fire. And from what I could tell, it was the garden shed, but the flames were licking dangerously towards the house itself, which was pretty dilapidated and, in particular, had a wooden balcony which could easily catch fire. I ran straight to number 19 and knocked, waking them up, and started yelling that the next door was on fire and it could spread to their house and they needed to get out of there right away. Now, as soon as I left number 19 with the family in tow, I was met by other neighbors who had also heard the commotion. A few of us had already called the fire brigade at the same time, and we were assured that they were on their way. I looked around, and I could not see the guy who lived in number 20. I assumed that he would have been first to evacuate, but no. Entering his garden was impossible, as he had a big wooden gate which was locked and would have been too slow to climb over. So in my infinite wisdom, I decided to head down the footpath that headed into town and try and yell for the guy who lived there, and also his cat, who I was very fond of. I took a few steps down from the footpath when suddenly there was another explosion from the shed. A huge, billowing wall of flame rolled over the wall and came thundering towards me, and the fire got so close to me that it singed my eyebrows and the hairs on my arms. I jumped backwards. If I had taken one single step forwards, I would have been hit by that wall of flame. Now, I'm certain that someone was looking out for me that day because I was so close to being immolated that, damn, it's honestly scary to even think about to this day. Now, the first brigade showed up and then the cops. And when the fire was put out and all the commotion had died down and some time had passed, we eventually discovered through our neighborhood watch liaison that it had been an act of arson. Someone had set the neighbor's shed on fire. Unfortunately, the neighbor had been storing a whole bunch of aerosol cans and fuel in his shed, which he really wasn't supposed to do, which had led to the fire being far more serious than was likely intended and far more dangerous. The reason that the owner hadn't fled the house was because he was actually away, staying with his son up country, and you'll be pleased to know that the cat was fine and was the first to flee. Now, I can't be sure, but I'm absolutely certain that the trio who set the fire to the hedge were also the ones who burned the shed. When they'd been walking past number 20, some of their vulgarity had been directed at the man who lived there in the house, so they clearly knew him, and there was a nearby pub which had CCTV cameras, and of course it wasn't working at the time, so nobody was identified. The arsonist or arsonists were never caught, but I know who it was. It was the drunk alcoholic smokers who recklessly threw burning cigarette butts around, and so just after our street had stopped stinking of a burning hedge, it started stinking of a burning shed. That was a fun year, with the smell of burning everything permeating our lives. At least nothing else had caught fire for nearly 2 decades now, and if it does, then I'm going to leave it up to other members of the neighborhood watch to go heroically diving into those flames. I don't recommend it, and I think I exhausted my luck when I almost caught on fire the first time. But you know, if I'm ever forced to save a cat from the flames, I can't promise I won't dive into that inferno again. I used to be part of a neighborhood watch group, and I was witness to an absolutely crazy, kind of creepy incident that sticks with me to this day. We live on a street just on the outskirts of a small town which has a higher than average crime rate. Our street itself has always been pretty lucky, avoiding being the focus of the town's worst offenders. There was the occasional attempted break-in, some power tools stolen from a few garden sheds, but that was really it. Now, that was before this spate of car vandalism. Almost every morning, we'd wake up to discover one of our cars had been keyed or the mirrors had been slashed off. Now, in a couple of cases, the badges on the front of the couple of cars had been stolen. Now, this was back when that was a lot easier to do. One of the neighbors owned a Mercedes, and I swear his badge must have been stolen 3 times over the course of a year or so, even after we put a stop to the worst of the vandalism. Now, the vandalism is what spurred us on to start taking the neighborhood watch duties seriously. We spoke to local law enforcement, asked for the best tips we could, befriended a community officer, and got a direct line to the local station. And they also agreed to send a patrol into our cul-de-sac as many nights as possible. Now, not to belittle our boys in blue, but I don't think I ever actually saw a cop patrolling our street. I guess in fairness, they did have better things to do, like preventing murders and violent stuff in the city, so it's not like I hold it against them. And that's what the neighborhood watch was for anyway. The vandalism continued though, so about 5 or 6 of us guys volunteered to take night duty until the vandal was caught. Now surely, if we spent the next night watching the small cul-de-sac, we'd catch that person or multiple people in the act. And that's what you'd think anyway. And yet somehow, after a couple of weeks of vigilance, we didn't spot a single suspicious character. And yet the vandalism continued. It was like the culprit was Spec Ops or a ghost or something crazy. But what kind of Spec Ops soldier spends his time army crawling along the ground keying cars? I wish I could offer an explanation of who did it and how, but that was still something we never discovered. Instead, this vandalizer decided to retire himself and go out with a bang. There had been a car parked at the end of our cul-de-sac for what seemed like forever. It had clearly been abandoned there, and a number of us neighborhood watch members had stuck flyers all over the car, pleading with the owner to just move along. All the tires had deflated by this point naturally, and the paintwork was incredibly rusty. Now, we called the city council about it multiple times, but nothing was ever done. And in the end, it just became sort of a staple of the street. We called the car Christine, after the Stephen King story, because it had the vague air of being haunted, or at least kind of sinister. Now, one night, it was my turn on night watch, and I was just working on my laptop looking out the window when I noticed a glow coming from the end of the cul-de-sac. My house was in the middle, so I had to look around to see exactly what it was. Immediately, I realized Christine was on fire from the inside. I ran outside, careful not to get too close, and these flames were just picking up inside of Christine's seats, but I couldn't immediately see a broken window or any way that the fire could have actually been started inside the car. I called the cops on my cell phone, so I'm glad I paused to do so because moments later, Christine exploded outward. It wasn't the kind of huge epic explosion you might see in the movies or expect from Call of Duty or something. I guess in part this was because the car had been sitting there for so long without any gas that there wasn't too much fuel to actually explode. It was enough to send pieces of shrapnel flying into the road or pieces of glass into the car parked near Christine, though, and it would certainly have been strong enough to cause me some serious damage if I'd actually approached like I had planned to. And soon the cops showed up, as did the fire department, and the vehicle's blaze was extinguished. Over the next few days, we learned that the fire had definitely been arson. A small hole had been drilled through the glass of one of Christine's windows, a tiny bit of accelerant had been poured through it, and then someone had fed a burning rag into the car. Now finally, the cops and the city council put up some effort into tracking Christine's owner, and this went absolutely nowhere. As it turned out, the license plate was just completely fake, registered to no vehicle on record, and the only thing they were able to trace was the engine, which belonged to a totally different, much older car that had been supposedly scrapped many years before. Now, there's no way Christine would have been able to drive at all with that engine installed, and the whole thing was just some mystery. Nobody had any idea when the car had turned up or what the purpose of all of it really was. Had the vandalism been some kind of preamble in order to burn Christine for some purpose? Some of us half expected the cops to find a charred body in the trunk, but there was nothing like that. The wreckage of the car got towed, and from that day forward, the vehicular vandalism just kind of stopped. Various other things happened with the neighborhood watch since then. I confronted a burglar, and one of my neighbors helped the cops arrest an SA offender on the run, and we successfully chased off a gang of drug dealers who'd started operating on the corner. But nothing ever came close to being as puzzling and mysterious or creepy as that series of vehicular vandalism and the mysterious Christine, the impossible car. Now, it's been nearly a decade since then, and I still think about it from time to time. At the very least, I wish I knew who had been responsible for the vandalism and how they'd been able to slip under my nose quite so successfully. But I guess some mysteries just never end up getting solved.